Names can be taught to behave. Tonight, we'll listen while a vow remembers how to breathe.
Continuity moves by inches, comforting as herald.
Questions can be chained, or they can become altars. The difference is a comma you're allowed to move. No drama, only competence. A name sits correctly.
Late courage looks like this, bread on schedule, a ledger learning to breathe.
Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. Tonight, we keep the kind that leaves questions awake.
If you're ready, dim the lights and keep one question lit inside your mind. Tonight, we'll open a door that was never meant to be found. I did not choose the stairs. The stairs chose me the first winter I was sent below alone. The corridor near the north transept had always been a kind of throat stone, swallowing breath and footsteps. But that night, it felt like a mouth rehearsing my name. I carried the lantern. Father Aurelius allowed me to keep brass, cheek-pocked, its glass honeyed with smoke, and a small leather satchel with a knife, a ruler, and the dull innocence of a copying novice. I remember how the lantern light didn't travel the way it does in novels. It didn't announce me. It clung instead, as if it feared the dark would confiscate it for using too much space. There is a point, 12 steps down, where the air changes into something more mineral than breath. You know it by the way your tongue registers copper and your ears hear the world as if submerged. We called it the seam. Old hands pretended it didn't exist. Old hands pretend a lot because to name a seam is to admit that something once was torn and someone had to stitch it. At the seam, you pass the last inscription anyone admits to reading. Servate tacitum keep the silence. Only the T of tacitum is new, recut, a slightly cleaner bite in the stone, as though an earlier T had worn down or been pried out. I crossed that seam with an obedience that was mostly curiosity taught to walk on its knees. The lantern made a circle of breath ahead of me. On the left, a door of cedar, hinged in iron that had learned to squeak softly from years of ritual oil. On the right, low niches, each with a clay amphora, numbered in a script so practiced it looked bored. The amphorae held nothing potable: crushed oak gulls, worm-eaten rag for blotting, soot the color of bruises. Ink, you learn, is not born. It is cooked from wounds. Father Aurelius had told me I was ready to copy the indexes in the restricted scriptorium of St. Thecla. He pronounced ready, as if it were a rope thrown to me from a boat that had already decided which direction it was going. An index seems harmless to the prideful. Only later do you discover that an index is a map of what you are not permitted to see, and maps are hungers pretending to be tools. The scriptorium itself is less a room than a widening of the corridor where shelves have remembered to become furniture. The shelves are chained, not because the books would flee if given a chance. Books are not quick, but because our hands are. Chains teach you that touch is alone. I counted 7 arm spans of shelf on the east wall, 8 on the west, the extra span on the west given to libri competiti, the shackled books whose iron ran through the spine as if stitching bone through bone. If one fell open, we were to shut it with the back of the hand, the way you smooth the fur of a dog that might bite calmly with respect for the teeth. You will copy the titles and the shelf marks, Aurelius had said that afternoon, pointing with the gentleness reserved for brittle things and the dangerous. If you encounter prayers, you will not copy them. Prayers are not text, they are tools. Tools copy users. Is cry. Into not, I understand. I lied. Because I understood only the grammar of permission, not its theology. His mouth became its usual line, the line that made him look like a statue everyone had agreed to call kind. The ledger was waiting with its cover off, as if a physician had already pronounced it survivable. On the first page, St. Thecla's inventory resumed the tidy paragraphs that convince bishops' shelves are better than people at telling the truth. The hand was excellent, a Latin that walked in its shoes. I sharpened my quill with the small knife that shaves thin hope from feather. I touched the iron gall ink the way one touches winter water quickly, then more bravely. The first titles posed as obedient nouns: De consecration nubus minoribus, De officiis tyronum, Ornamenta capillarii, Furniture of faith, nothing to fear. I wrote without thinking, the way an obedient man breathes. Half an hour into quiet industry, the doorway behind me remembered to be a doorway. A shadow crossed the lantern, not a person but the idea of one. I did not turn. It is one of the things you learn. When the archivum breathes, you don't interrupt its lungs. Then the breathing passed, and what remained was the dry patience of dust thinking itself immortal. It was on the 13th folio that the ink changed color, ash blue, as if someone had diluted ink with fog. A heading in that color, De exorcistis antiquis, on the ancient exorcists. The words did not bristle with drama. They did the opposite. They sat as if nothing were wrong. Beneath the heading, an index entry, no page numbers, only shelf marks, and a symbol, a circle broken by a ladder. I had seen that symbol before, carved under the confessionals, in a chapel no one wanted to admit had been rebuilt. Men call it Jacob's ladder, so they do not have to call it a rupture. Here the rungs descended rather than climbed. I copied the symbol, my hand pretending ignorance. The ash-blue ink kept appearing at distances that felt deliberate, as if its author believed that attention should advance by puzzle rather than paragraph. A note in the margin, unlabeled, written as though the writer didn't want credit even from himself. Temporis phantasma phantom time. 2 more words. Usuarium editio users edition. The phrase had the courage of blasphemy. I wrote it down before my conscience could remind my hand whose roof it slept under. I was not alone. A soft sound to my right, the coiling of a chain after a movement. If a chained book moves, either you are not alone or you are not safe inside yourself. I lifted the lantern slightly and thanked the glass for not being honest about how small I am. The light found the iron rings on the shelf, and then the title embossed on a spine that someone had tried to unname with a rasp. You can erase legible letters, but you cannot erase the pressure they once exerted on the leather. Nomen, the word for name, but also a rumor about its weight. Scribes do not love nouns, Father Aurelius had told us the week before, walking between desks like a man testing planks on a dock. We love verbs. Verbs move without chains. No one laughed. We were learning that humor is a tool of power, and we had not yet been issued any. I put the lantern down and made my hand ordinary again. The index instructed me to list 3 related entries: De demonum catalogo secundo, ritus nominationis novae, de fide restitutione, per substitutionem, the right of new naming, the restoration of faith by substitution. The second title shifted under my eyes like a fish in muddy water. New naming? We had been taught that God named, and man answered, and that was the end of that grammar. The idea of naming as an act. You could aim at a soul the way you aim, a lens that was not a doctrine I recognized in any catechism, meant for those who breathe sunlight. I should have called for Aurelius. There is a small bell for that, iron tuned to the key of obedience. I did not ring it. Obedience, in me, had always been an understudy. Curiosity took the stage without permission. The ash-blue notes spoke in the polite tone of murderers who are certain they are improving your neighborhood. On the correction of calendars that the laity might understand providence, one line read. On the excision of duplicate sanctity, another. So tidy, so administrative. Tidy the saints, correct the days. One cannot blame a housekeeper for cleaning the house, unless one sees the house is a mind. The word that shook me was not demon, not exorcist, not even phantom. It was the small Latin rubric, italicized as if it were too shy to stand upright. Anima in discordia cum nomen, a soul in disagreement with its name. If you are raised inside stone, you are taught that names are ladders. You climb the one you were assigned. The idea that a soul might hold its ladder at arm's length, suspicious of its rungs, felt like treason and relief in one breath. I copied and copied. The ledger's skin felt warm to the wrist, the way a cathedra feels after a bishop stands up. I lost track of my own pulse until the lantern made its familiar threat, one cough, then another, and reminded me, oil is more realistic than faith. I trimmed my wick and watched the flame behave beautifully for the attention. You learn a lot about hierarchy from a small fire in a large place. Somewhere above, a choir warmed vowels into something the stones remembered how to hold. They always practiced at the divisible hours. Choirs teach you about time. If you are awake, you hear that time is louder when it is measured by a human throat than by a bell. I let the music bleed into my spine and then away. The ash blue kept arguing. The rite of new naming begins with instructions that pretend to be harmless. Procure a basin of salted water, warmed by a single candle that has never been used for any other sacrament. Select a quill from a bird that cannot fly. Mix ink from gall, myrrh, and vinegar. Fast 3 days, so that truth in your mouth is not slowed by the griefs of digestion. These are the sort of lists that make men feel competent, so they stop wondering if they are good. The afflicted person is not to be called possessed. The rubric says so with a firmness that resembles mercy. It names the condition not as invasion but as disagreement. Discordia 2 chords tuned to different keys. The celebrant is to write the baptized name on parchment, and then, after listening to the distortions that have grown like lichens on the soul, write a shadow name, one that fits the deformity as plaster fits a broken limb. The two names are then pressed together, face to face, stitched with horsehair, and placed under the ear of the afflicted for 7 breaths, while the celebrant tells a story, not of doctrine but of origin, subtly altered, dates rearranged, witnesses changed, the season moved by a month so that memory, which is a choir, finds itself singing a new refrain. The rubric warns, do not pull more thread than you can weave back. I read that line 3 times. I heard Aurelius say my name once. He was not in the room. The stones have learned ventriloquism. The lantern, disliking philosophy, dimmed. I fed it a little oil from the skin flask and forgave it its pragmatism. The index sent me to a shelf I had not been allowed to touch before. Inventarium, 12 charts and registers. Charts always pretend to be honest. They have lines, they behave. The first tube held a map of the Adriatic, with a monastery sketched on a peninsula I knew did not exist. The note beside it, in ash blue, removed to prevent duplicate reverence. What would duplicate reverence be? A saint with too many places to be holy? The next chart overlaid star positions with feast days, with a neatness that outperformed coincidence. A margin line wrote itself in my mouth as I read, "Calendars are the softest clay." That is how I first truly understood phantom time, not as a conspiracy whispered over soup, but as an artisan craft. You excise a week. You push a feast toward a comet you cannot afford to ignore. You move a coronation one lunar phase to the right, so that a prophecy remembered in the wrong voice conforms to a new throat. History is a sentence. Move the comma. Convict a different man. My hand trembled so politely, the quill did not notice. I pinned it between finger and thumb and pretended steadiness until steadiness returned, as it often does when you refuse panic the attention it requests. Behind me, something like a sigh and not a sigh. The chain again, a fractional settling. I turned, lantern barely lifted, and found the book, whose spine carried gnomon, had opened itself by the width of a breath. "No," I said aloud, and because the stones love oaths, they made my no sound like a vow. I closed the book with the back of my hand, tender as a mother setting down a sleeping child. The chain accepted the correction with the decorum of a clerk. It is a hard thing to admit, but confession, if it is not hard, is just biography. I copied a prayer. I did it with the arrogance of a man who has never yet been harmed by knowing. The prayer was short. It invoked no names. It called on functions. The one who unknots, the one who unglues, the one who stills the echo. It asked that a name be made obedient to its bearer, and a bearer be returned to a name without surplus or deficit. If you have never felt your mouth change shape to accommodate words that do not belong to your century, you will not understand the intimacy of saying them. My tongue learned an old choreography. My palate received an unloved guest. When I finished, the lantern flame made that tall, thin body it forms when a room holds its breath. Nothing else happened. The obedient often mistake delay for mercy. I put my quill down and I put my hand on my own throat. I said my name aloud, the one my mother whispered into churching linen, and listened for the sound I had always thought was me. It answered. It did not arrive on time. It came a half heartbeat late, like an echo in a small church pretending to be a cathedral. I said my name again. The echo shortened, resentful. The ash blue on the page looked wetter than it was. Footsteps, then. The merciful kind you can assign to a man you know rather than to every fear you have stored in the dark like wine. Aurelius entered the scriptorium without apology. He had a way of filling rooms without moving air. He looked at my ledger first, then at my hands. He always inspected hands. "Your ink," he said, "is honest. It has not tried to run ahead of you." "I found the index for the exorcists," I said, aiming my voice at a plank between us rather than at his face. I copied the headings. He examined the ash blue notations the way a mason examines an arch that should not be standing. "Ash blue is a private habit," he murmured. "When you find it, you are reading someone who was less interested in being read than in not being misunderstood." "What is phantom time?" I asked, the question so naked it embarrassed the stones. Is it a theory, or is it done? It is a tool, he said. He did not sit. He made the word tool sound like a scalpel placed in an untrained hand. We do not deny the heavens move. We deny the laity the right to trip over their own calendars, trying to follow. We tidy, we counter air, we redirect floods. And the right of new naming? I should have shut my mouth with my own hand. He did me the courtesy of not pretending not to hear. Confession is a name exchange, he said. The same sentence he had given me when I still thought a library is a snow globe that never melts. Sometimes the name that answers is not the one given. Sometimes it is stubborn. Sometimes it carries a history that injures the present tense. We teach names to behave. We rename souls, I said, and the eye of my sentence did not sound like me. I noticed. He noticed that I noticed. We restore, he said. We return. Rename is a word for people who have never been broken by a mirror. He reached past me and set a candle on the table. It was not the lantern's flame. It was a narrower, more surgical light. He touched its fire to life without blessing, as if to remind me that not all flames have patrons. Read me the prayer you copied, he said. He did not scold. He did not threaten. He made obedience unavoidable by making it reasonable. My throat tightened. The words were already on my tongue, the choreography learned, the steps remembered by muscle faster than conscience. I recited the invocation to the one who unknots, the one who unglues, the one who stills the echo. I spoke the request that a name be made obedient and a bearer be returned without surplus or deficit. The candle's flame shortened as if to listen more closely. When I finished, Aurelius nodded, pleased not with me but with the technique, the way a surgeon nods at a clean suture on a practice cloth. Now, he said, and the word now landed on my chest like a weight. Say your name, I said it. It arrived this time on time, but wearing someone else's shoe. My ears did not believe my mouth. The echo roused and sat back down. A bead of sweat formed behind my left ear, where the stitched names, if they had existed, would have been pressed. I thought of the horsehair thread the rubric recommended, and my skin imagined the prick of it. Name is order, Aurelius said softly, as if he feared waking a bird no one could see. When order is unkind, we adjust it. When memory returns incorrect, we correct it. We do not lie, we edit. Everyone edits. We simply have the better tools. I wanted to say something iron, something that would lock my mouth against his grammar. What I said was, "What if the name resists?" He smiled with only half his face. Then it has told you where its boundaries are. We respect boundaries. We redraw them so others may respect them also. He left me with the candle and the ash blue, and the knowledge that I had done something irreversible to my own mouth. Being left is a skill. I practiced it. I copied 3 more headings and pretended the paper had not learned my pulse. When the bell above caught the hour with the confidence only bells possess, I closed my ledger, cleaned my quill with vinegar, and filled the lantern the way a poor man fills a promise enough to get home. Not enough to forget there are stairs before morning. On the walk back up, the seam tasted stronger. Servate tacitum, the new tea glared. The old letters relaxed into their erosion. I stopped at the turn where a plastered saint pretended to be older than it was, and ran my fingers along a hairline crack that had learned to be a shadow. In the crack, the ash of an earlier fresco, a hand once painted to bless anyone who meant well. The current hand blessed anyone who kept quiet. In my cell that night, cell in the monastic sense, not the punitive, though the distinction is more grammatical than real, I lay on the straw that had learned my back and tested my name the way a jeweler tests a coin between teeth. It sounded like me. It tasted like metal. I turned my face to the wall where a draft numbers its way down the plaster. I spoke the prayer again, quietly. Syllables knotted and unknotted with care, and I listened for changes in the architecture of my throat. I slept as men sleep when they have touched a lever and cannot unlearn where it is. The morning confessed itself through the window the way a servant confesses a broken dish apologetically, with light. I attended prime with the others, knees behaving, mouth disciplined, chant finding its slot in me as it always had. Yet the Latin felt newly engineered, a machine whose cogs had been polished overnight. Where the psalm spoke of name, I heard command. Where it praised memory, I heard obedience asking permission to live. After the office, Aurelius placed a small key in my palm, its bow shaped like a tear turned horizontal. Inventarium 12, he said, as if I had asked for it. You will copy the charts. Then, after the polite pause men use to place a decision where you cannot reach it, he added, leave the ash-blue margins for another day. And I understand, I said, and my mouth made the sentence without me. We both pretended the sound was mine. I returned below with the key pressing its shape into my skin. The cedar door offered me its hinges as a greeting. I returned the courtesy with the oil our order favors, an oil that smells faintly of rain learned by copper. Inside, the charts waited like patients, aware of their prognosis. I opened the first tube and breathed the dust of places. The map unfurled with the dignity of old skin. Coastlines declared themselves with arrogance. Roads argued. Margins held notes that believed themselves humble. There, in a hand I now recognized, stars overlaid with feasts, solstices paired to fit. The Julian melted into the Gregorian like two metals forced to coexist in one ring. In a far corner, a comet drawn not like a sign but like a gear. The notation neat, operator, not omen, not warning, tool. I traced the laddered circle with my forefinger and felt the grime of time accumulate on the tip. The ladder's rungs went down, down, down. I thought of the confessional, with its wood softened by the oils of penitent foreheads, the carved sign there too, and how once, as a boy, I pressed my brow to the rung and felt the wood give a little, as if it were not supporting me but inviting me to remember which way I was actually traveling. Aurelius's shadow took shape along the wall before he did. You slept, he said, not as a question. I practiced, I answered, and we both let the pronoun hang with the arrogance of an unrepentant sinner. He moved to the shelf of shackled books and put his hand on Naaman, the way a man tests a banister that will not survive another winter. Names are bones, he said. They teach the body how to stand. And if the bone is set wrong, I asked, then the body limps until someone brave breaks it, he said simply, and looked at me as if to see whether my face would admit its own fracture. I turned back to the charts. The ash-blue note near the monastery that wasn't read, vacated to prevent duplication of reverence. I picked at the grammar. Vacated. As if holiness were a room you could empty without leaving behind the smells of soup, smoke, and argument. Duplication. As if God were an accountant and attention a currency with only so many coins. I copied the line without editorial. Scribes learn to let their ink lie for them. Below the charts, a register of canonized names with 3 columns. Given, feast, status. In the rightmost column, an adjective no one uses unless they have already moved furniture in the mind, redistributed. The saints weren't erased, they were relocated. Their stories did not vanish. They were told by other mouths on other days, until nobody remembered whose hands had accomplished what, only that something good had been accomplished by someone pious at some canonical hour, a precise kind of mercy that wears erasure like a veil, a thinner ledger, meaner, hid beneath, de pontificibus substitutus. On substituted popes, the pages bristled with euphemism, caretakers, interims, the grammar of continuity of sign that a careful reader recognizes as a trained way of saying, we could not afford an interruption, so we invented an unbroken line and taught everyone else to see it. Seals compared by season winter wax behaving like an old man's blood, summer wax like a boy's. Rings measured by the bite they leave on soft metal. I copied without looking up until the lantern, loyal servant, reminded me again that nothing burns for free. I tell you these details not to seduce you into my profession, but to show you how ordinary the extraordinary feels when it is filed neatly. Terror dresses itself in tidy columns. Fear prefers a ledger to a scream. At noon, if noon is a notion underground, I set the quill down and let my fingers rest on the edge of the table. My fingertips tingled. I said my name in my head and waited for it to arrive. It came. I tasted iron again. I said the shadow of my name, the one the prayer had allowed into my mouth without permission, a name with too many consonants, as if someone had tried to pack more history into it than my throat had room to host. My ears did not recognize it. My tongue did. The Codex had been right about one thing. Memory is a liturgy. Change the refrain and the congregation. Your thoughts, your instincts will start to hum along before your intellect has even found the page. I folded my hands to arrest the tremor and raised my eyes to the ceiling that is not a ceiling, but a tunnel pretending not to be a throat. Do not pull more thread than you can weave back, the rubric said. I had already tugged. I did not yet know how to sew. When I left the scriptorium that day, the seam tasted like coins. I pressed my thumb into the tea of tacitum and thought about the new cut of it, sharper, cleaner, too certain of its own angle. Somebody had replaced a letter and expected everyone else to call the wall original. That, I would learn, is the trick with time. You recut a single T and hope the sentence behaves. You hope no one runs their thumb along the groove and feels the difference between the centuries. I climbed the stairs. The lantern did not complain. Above, the choir rehearsed an antiphon with such precision even confession would have envied its meter. I walked past St. Apollonia's hall, the brass gate that never had a key winking with its old sin, and in the reflection I saw a man whose mouth no longer belonged exclusively to him. I nodded to my own cowardice, because cowardice deserves at least the courtesy of being seen, and I promised myself I would not ring the bell for permission the next time I felt a prayer try to learn me. By evening, when the bells found vespers and the world briefly agreed about which hour it was, I took my place in the stall, the wood sighing as it recognized my weight, and sang, "The Psalms are a harness. They keep a man from galloping into uses of himself he cannot survive." I wore the harness, and I thanked it. Then, in the silence after the closing collect, when the other shoes murmured toward supper, I said very softly into the hollow space in front of my lips, "I hear you." I did not specify to whom. The world, politely, did not answer. That night I dreamed of 2 sheets of parchment held face to face and stitched along the margins with horsehair, the thread making question marks as it circled, each curve a small insistence. In the dream, I pressed the stitched names under my ear and listened. The first voice I heard was my own. The second arrived on a delay so slight a patient man could call it coincidence. In the morning, I could not remember which one had sounded kinder. I woke with the taste of vinegar and myrrh in my mouth, and the knowledge like a small stone I could not spit out that I would go back below, that I would trace the ladder that descends, and that sooner than I wanted I would ask a room with chains for permission to tell me who I was. Silence was not sacred, it was enforced. But the stones, God bless them, had learned a second vocation no one had taught them. They kept the questions warm. I returned underground, as if the stairs had signed me out on a leash. The key to Inventarium 12 knocked softly against my thigh with each step, a polite percussion that kept my courage marching in time. At the seam I paused and put my palm to the cold script again, servate ticitum, wondering, as a locksmith might, which letter would misbehave next if someone with cleaner chisels decided history needed another haircut. The lantern circle opened like a quiet mouth around me, and I stepped through it as though the light were a threshold with its own rules of courtesy. The charts waited, obedient and treacherous in the way that obedient things sometimes are. I unfurled an atlas of diocesan boundaries and watched provinces warp along rivers that had changed their minds. Over the boundary lines, ash-blue notes perch the way, swallows cling to a nave beam, lightly, confidently, certain that stone exists to be borrowed. Consolidation for the sake of catechesis, one note said. Another, excision of redundant history. Redundant history, imagine a phrase like that surviving in air without turning into smoke. I copied, ink keeping a steady gait, and let my eye stray to the edges where the deceptive work always lives. In a curled corner, someone had recorded a comet's return with the indifference of a man noting a visitor who smells of rain. To the right of the comet, a feast moved forward 9 days. To the left, a birth, revised to coincide with a prophecy that had almost come true without being asked to. I traced my finger along the triangles of new chronology, felt nothing, and felt everything. Time, I began to understand, does not consent, it is educated. The unseen editor announced himself, not by name he would never, but by a habit of correction so meticulous, it exposed the fear under the neatness. He, perhaps it was more than one, but my mind preferred a single ghost had a grammar that made sentences behave when they wanted to prophesy. He wrote in ash blue when he did not want the bishops to notice, and in rust black when he did. He annotated with verbs that lean toward hygiene, align, reconcile, temper, conflate. He never wrote destroy. He never wrote lie. He wrote tidy. He wrote restore. He wrote secure. That last word has the softness of a pillow and the density of a stone. It was late in the morning, if morning can be a rumor underground, when I heard, not footsteps, but the sigh of a page 2 aisles away. A page that had decided its hinge wanted a different angle. I raised the lantern, left the charts to continue their quiet rehearsal of obedience, and followed the breath of paper. The aisle ended at a cabinet of chained folios, the color of old smoke. One of them had opened a finger's width, the chain giving enough slack for a glance, not enough for a conversation. The spine was unremarkable, unnamed, as though anonymity were part of its binding right. I should have fetched Aurelius. Instead, I learned for the first time how a person becomes an archivist, not of books but of their own disobedience. The folio's top right corner bore a brand, a circle interrupted by a ladder descending, Jacob's symbol inverted, or perhaps simply honest about gravity. Inside, neat columns, pairings that read like obituaries written for lives that were still inconveniently breathing. On the left, given name. On the right, restored name. Beneath each pair, a line of narrative adjustment. Birthplace altered by 60 miles. Witness exchanged. Season moved from Lent to Advent, or vice versa. A simple trade, the way one moves a candle from one shelf to another so that the shadow a room thinks it knows must learn a new habit. It would have been easy to despise the hand that wrote those restorations. That is, the sport of novices. What I felt, instead, was the intimacy of it. Like a tailor kneeling with pins, mouth full of needles and apologies. The unseen editor believed he was returning people to themselves, shearing barnacles from their names, sanding the roughness that kept them from fitting into the ecclesial furniture. It is an indecency to be so sure. A name I knew was stitched into one of the folio's margins, not stitched with thread, but with a flourished underline that behaved like one. M.T., the initials of a sister who kept the sacristy in order, with a severity that felt like love taught to walk on narrow shoes. Her given name could not be mistaken. The restored name differed by one letter, a substitution so humble it would pass unnoticed in any ledger that paid by the hour. The footnote in ash blue read, "Correct to avoid confusion with relic bearer. Correct to avoid confusion. Not protect, not bless. Correct, Sister M.T." Had, in fact, cried once in the sacristy when a reliquary labeled with her saint's name arrived bearing another saint's jaw. "They don't ask our bones," she had said, wiping her face with the sleeve she never allowed near the chalice. I wondered now which confusion the editor had soothed and which he had sculpted. I looked up, the way some men do when they want the ceiling to discipline the floor for telling the truth. Stone offered me its patience and its indifference. I turned a page. The column of popes no, not popes, caretakers, a euphemism so polished it reflected my own mouth, showed small dislocations at the edges, a seal matched, a ring borrowed, a handwriting taught to fake winter. Continuity, the entry explained in that merciful ash blue, is a sacrament of its own. You keep it with theater when you cannot keep it with truth. I should have felt the room chill then, a coldness to match the offense. Instead, a warmth rose in the throat, the way it does when a person realizes a lie has been told for the sake of keeping a child asleep while a house is moved around her. Mercy, I realized, is an untidy thing. False mercy is surgical. The unseen editor loved scalpels. When Aurelius finally entered, he seldom knocked in rooms where knocking would embarrass the walls. He did not glance first at me, but at the hinge of the folio, as if hingers had moral lives. He touched the chain, then the edge of the open page, then the brand of the descending ladder. "Some books open when they hear a familiar hunger," he said, and smiled his stone smile. "Have you eaten today?" "Breakfast," I answered, because the truth is a habit I practice, even when it refuses to practice me. But I have been reading other people's meals. Names are salted, he said, as if the opinion were uncontroversial. They preserve and desiccate in equal measure. He had shedder. What happens, I asked, when the restored name fits the wrong mouth? He let the question shrug against his robe and fall. We do not attempt the right without witnesses, he said. A celebrant alone mistakes their preferences for providence. With witnesses, the fabric pulls back into shape. He looked at my hands again. You have been steady. I have been edited. I said before the wiser person in me could gag the sentence. He nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the way a physician nods to a symptom he cannot afford to dismiss. We should speak of the ash blue, he said finally, as if he had decided the rope around my waist could be trusted not to snap. They will pretend they are not a council. They will succeed in pretending. They are the index behind the index. Why ash blue? I asked. Because the color had already occupied the part of my mind that likes to collect the habits of its captors. Because black ink belongs to the minutes, he replied. Ash blue belongs to the margins. It is the color of apology that never arrives. He held his hand out without looking and found the little candle he had placed upon the table the day before. Flint spoke to Wick. Wick listened. Light practiced its humility. We walked he backwards, I forwards into a narrower chamber that had learned to look like an afterthought. The fresco above us was crumbling politely, as though it had been taught by good people how to age without causing offense. Jacob's ladder again, but painted in reverse perspective so that the rungs seemed to recede while walking toward us. In one corner, the angel who wrestled was shown not grappling a man but untangling a knot of thread that writhed as though it were the musculature of a story, learning to admit it had always been a braid. The ash blue meet here when the fresco sheds enough dust to make them feel mortal, Aurelius said. Astronomers who claim to be theologians who claim to have lost their spectacles when the sky is clear, a chemist who smells not of sacramental wine but of vinegar and copper. They do not call themselves anything because names invite witnesses, and witnesses record minutes, and minutes become anniversaries. What do they do? I asked, though I had already in my ledger copied their verbs. They retell, he said simply. They translate out of danger. They choose which part of the story is the story. He crouched with the confidence of a man whose knees had not yet asked for permission and lifted a loose tile. Beneath, a small drawer, dry with secrecy. He slid it open with 2 fingers. Inside, a little book, bound in something the color of shut eyes. He removed it the way a beekeeper lifts a comb, confident, tender, aware of the punishments available to the inattentive. The book's title was A Whisper, Addenda ad Codicem, Additions to the Codex. Not a part of the Codex, mind you, only the additions. The tail of the dog that refused to admit it wagged the head. He set it on my palm, and I felt its pulse, the warmth that comes from being needed by too many hands and forgiven by too few. The first page offered a table of contents that behaved like a menu. Calendars corrected, saints redistributed, relics consolidated, testimonies harmonized. Harmonized, a musical verb, enlisted for an archival crime. Why not simply leave the false parts to die? I said, because the question felt like a small door I could still close if it let in the wrong weather. Falsehood outlives neglect, Aurelius said. It craves it. Attention is the only solvent we own that can thin it. We retell. He spoke as a man repeats a catechism he has edited himself, ashamed but proud that his version scans better. I turned a page. A line caught me by the throat with the ambivalence of mercy that has not met its victim, where duplication of sanctity would dissipate reverence, consolidate to a single narrative locus. It was doctrine as traffic control. Holiness, the line assumed, traveled badly in crowds. Do you believe this? I asked, the question ugly with the intimacy it demanded of a man I increasingly feared was kind. I believe in continuity, he said, after a pause that made the fresco dust listen. I have seen what happens when a story loses its skeleton. Bones doing as they please in the dark. Have you seen that? You mistake it for freedom, until you need to stand. Bones set wrong keep a body alive, I said. Set straight, they make it walk again. Set straight hurts, he said. Hurt invites pity. Pity invites witnesses. Witnesses invite minutes. He closed the drawer and dusted the tile with his sleeve. A courtesy somewhere between priestly and housekeeping. I returned to the charts with the little addenda nested in my satchel, heavier than its size, the way a new promise outweighs an old oath. My quill learned the taste of the word redistribute, and hated me for teaching it. Near the bottom of a page, I found a marginal arrow that chased itself back to the top where a neat sentence wore its politeness to death. Excision of Thomasine logia, to prevent confusion with canonical narrative. They had not burned sayings, they had domesticated them. A gospel sleeps more deeply inside an allegory than under any ash. The day thinned. Lanterns are clocks that refuse to admit it. In that thinning, a memory rose of the first time I saw a body that would not accept its given name. A boy, 12 or 13, hair cut into obedience, eyes untidy as any morning. He would not say I in confession. He said, the child. The priest in the booth older, good in a way that gives God the burden of proof, gently asked why. Because the sisters gave me doesn't fit, the child answered, and hid his face as if a word might look back and recognize him as a thief. I had not been there as a priest. I had been there sweeping wax shards from a vigil that had burned too long. Later, I learned the boy was taken to a celebrant competent in the rite of new naming. The instructions do not call for drama. They call for 7 breaths, whispered origin, slight adjustments to season, to witness, to the angle of light in the room of memory. The boy returned, calling himself I, with the dignity of a man reclaiming his coat after the weather has changed. I had judged the right then too cleverly. Now, with ash-blue margins tugging at my sleeve, I wondered whose coat he had been taught to wear, whether the hem had been let down to fit a narrative taller than his shoulders. I copied until my hand numbed to the wrist and then revived with the ritual of shaking and vinegar. Aurelius left, returned, left again, his presence alternating with the clock of my fear. Once, he set a bowl of soup beside me without making me stop, the way a guard who is secretly kind feeds a prisoner he thinks deserves a trial. Eat, he said. Ink is salt enough. When he was gone for longer than his shadow could excuse, the room settled into a transparency I have only ever found in places whose job is to resist light. Chains hung with the patience of old men in a park. The gnomon spine stared at me not with eyes but with the absence where such things would pretend to be. I stood, not because standing would help, but because I had been sitting long enough to feel guilty. I touched the spine, then the chain, then the brand of the ladder. The leather felt like a question that has learned to bother only men who answer. I opened Nomen a hand's width. The first folio cracked along a crease the way old laughter cracks when invited to return. Columns of pairs, given, restored, beneath each, the short story of how one became the other. Moved feast, attenuates scandal of birth near eclipse. Witness, changed from midwife to chaplain, to prevent duplication of clerical rumor. Season adjusted to correct weather of memory. The last line was the kind that ruins sleep. When a name breaks, music is the first to limp. I did not understand until I tried to hum a psalm, and the tune arrived dressed for another occasion. My mouth traveled the right route. My ear disapproved of the destination. This is how the Codex punishes the curious. It rearranges the familiar until loyalty is tired enough to nod along. In a pocket at the back of Nomen, a square of parchment stitched shut with horsehair. No seal. Seals are for men who need to be seen to be serious. The horsehair was knotted in question marks. Meticulous, patient, the work of a hand that asked forgiveness without admitting guilt. I lifted the square to the lantern and saw the ghost of letters immodest enough to be legible through the skin. A name, then another name below it, then a line. Place beneath the ear of the celebrant and read the origin in a voice that belongs to no one. A voice that belongs to no one. The ash blue always find a way to make blasphemy sound like housekeeping. I did not unstitch the square. I am not heroic. I am a clerk whose hands know their wages. I returned it to the pocket and closed Nomen with the back of my hand the way one closes a cradle taught to rock itself. The chain settled in gratitude or threat. I could not tell which. On my way back to the charts, the lantern's reflection in a brass hinge behaved like a coin tossed into water. The ripple bent the world into concentric obedience and then stopped. I thought of phantom time not only as a calendar trick but as a moral one. You do not erase, you revise. You push the ripple out and watch the shore behave. The child you were does not complain. He was never given minutes. Aurelius's voice arrived from the doorway like a judgment that had not yet decided if it was angry. "You've met Nomen," he said. He never asked questions when answers might accuse him of knowing them already. "It keeps a ledger of restorations," I said. "It keeps a ledger of obedience." "Obedience needs ledgers," he replied gently. "Otherwise it undoes itself at the first kindness." It was he 10. "Do the ash blue ever rename themselves?" I asked, an insolence dressed as curiosity. He almost smiled with both halves of his mouth. "All editors are failed authors," he said. "We rename ourselves by pretending we didn't." We stood a while with the useful silence of men who would ruin the moment by thinking they deserve it. Then he walked me back to the fresco room and sat on the lowest rung of painted ladder as if the paint would support him. "Do you want to know how the right fails?" he asked. "I want to know how anything fails down here," I said. "It fails," he said, "when the story told to the ear refuses to rent an apartment in the bones. The celebrant whispers a new order, birth, witness, season, causes, dressed as coincidences. The ear listens, the mouth consents, the mind signs, and the body declines to move in. In those cases, we accept the stubbornness as a boundary placed by God or by a grief that has not yet settled. We wait. We do not pull more thread." "And when it succeeds?" I asked, hating myself that I wanted to hear what I already feared. "It succeeds, quietly. The person goes home different and calls the difference continuity." He looked at my throat the way a physician looks at a bruise he intends to pretend not to see. Sometimes the celebrant is pulled instead. We have not a created. The prayer copies the user, I said, my own voice returning from yesterday like a messenger who has found me again only because I never moved. The prayer practices on the mouth that practices it, he corrected, kinder than doctrine usually allows. Words have teeth. We insist they chew the right meal. They are omnivores. He dismissed me without dismissal rose, gathered the stray ash from the fresco's shoulder into his palm, as if saving a saint's dandruff, and left without taking the light with him. I sat where he had sat, on the painted rung, and felt the old absurd temptation to climb into a picture to see if the artist had left a back door. There is always a back door. Editors specialize in them. Back at my desk I copied an entry I feared. On the Magdalene's sermon, reduced to allegory to prevent conflation with canonical teaching on witness. Reduced to allegory. Allegory is a sackcloth big enough to hide men and motives and miracles equally well. I wrote the sentence without editorial sigh. Later, I would practice a sigh that produced no fog on the glass. By the end of the watch, my ledger had learned my hand so well, it began to predict my mind. I put down the quill to deny it that power. The lantern coughed again. Oil is always the truest bell. I fed it, trimmed the wick, and noticed that where the wick blackened, it resembled letters at the end of a long paragraph, a sentence finished by someone finally willing to stop. I left the room softly, as if stone had ears and a temper, and climbed to a cloister that had taught ivy not to embarrass itself with ambition. The air took charge of my lungs again, the way a mother takes the pan from a child who insists he can lift it. I sat on the bench where my first Latin teacher once told me that declension is the art of teaching nouns humility. The evening lay wide and ordinary. The sky did a practiced version of blue. For a moment I allowed myself the sin that is also a grace. I forgot. After Compline, the abbey quieted into the kind of silence that volunteer soldiers call peace, and veterans call the interval before the next command. In my cell, I placed the addenda under my pillow, a tender superstition I learned from a brother who said books teach you while you sleep if you confess your ignorance before you close your eyes. I whispered the prayer to the one who unknots, the one who unglues, the one who stills the echo. I heard the answer in the room's corners, a small adjustment, like a tailor pinching fabric where it insists on honesty. I dreamt of calendars as kitchens, pots of days simmering, spice of eclipses, a bay leaf of comet thrown in with a frown. In the dream, the unseen editor tasted, grimaced, and added ash-blue salt until the stew accepted the spoons of bishops. When I woke, I had the weary gratitude of men who have not been killed yet by what they do for a living. Morning returned and did its job. The seam waited. The stairs performed their old hospitality. Below, the ash blue had left a smell of copper, vinegar, and a perfume I could not name, perhaps the arrogance of order. The fresco had shed fresh dust. I brushed it into my palm like a housekeeper with sacramental ambitions, and returned it to the shadowed sill, as if dust as a species needed a home. On the desk, a folder had been placed with the ceremony of anonymity. No label, no seal. Inside, a single sheet. Procedure for harmonizing testimonies concerning apparitions in rural districts. The verbs were tired, but still dangerous. Consolidate, normalize, redact. The final line wore the unctuous tone of a theologian with a headache. Let us leave room for mystery, where contradictions cannot be made to marry. I smiled with the rudeness of a man who has just learned to recognize politeness as a weapon. Mystery, in that sentence, was a sack. Throw in what you cannot make tidy, call it holy. I copied the procedure because that was the honor I paid to the employer I was already learning to betray. Then, with a care that would have embarrassed a better man, I wrote my name on a scrap. Then below it, a shadow of it, the prayer had once suggested, the consonants too many, the vowels in a formation that made my mouth feel like a foreign country, speaking my own language with an accent it admired. I placed the two under my ear. Paper is lighter than horsehair, but not lighter than guilt, and I whispered a new origin for myself, watching in my mind the corridor of my childhood tilt by one tile. The echo answered first, then my name. This time, they arrived together, like two soldiers who had spent a winter in the same coat. I removed the papers and burned them over the candle with the piety of a heretic who wants to keep the ashes for later. The smoke smelt of vinegar and a library that forgives. My ears rang with the song of a psalm I had never learned but had always known was waiting for me if I allowed the words to rearrange the furniture. Aurelius appeared at the edge of the light, like an apology that is practiced not making itself obvious. "You look taller," he said. "I put on a different story," I answered. "It fits," he said, and I could not tell whether his voice approved of me or of the technique. He inclined his head toward the corridor of chained spines. "There is a ledger you have not yet seen," he added. "It is called De Memoria Communi, on the common memory." He pronounced the title as if memory were a parish, and he the priest who, knowing everyone's sins, loved them anyway, because he preferred the job to its alternatives. We found the ledger between an inventory of surplus chalice veils and a register of keys cursed by being necessary. De Memoria Communi was smaller than it should have been, and heavier than one wants it to be. Inside, no names, only events, and beneath each event, the craft by which its memory had been taught to sit in the pew of the present. Move famine 2 years later to protect coronation from scandal of providence contested. Relocate plague southward to preserve rumor of northern sanctity. Transform failed treatise on metallurgy into miracle of incorruptible iron to serve reliquary narratives. I read until my sympathy ran out and then refilled it the way a man refills a well he has found boys drowning in. It is easy to condemn the keepers of memory. It is harder to confess the relief you feel when the world makes sense, even if the sense was installed overnight. "What is the limit?" I asked, my finger on the line about famine's 2-year exile. "The living who remember," he said. "That is why we prefer to revise recently with a gentle hand and revision far in the past with confidence." Witness fades. Ledger ages well. He touched the page, where a corner had become a curl, and flattened it with the tenderness of an uncle. "It is not only the church," he added, and his voice went lower, as if the stones did not deserve to carry the next sentence. "Kings, guilds, husbands, sons, we are not a monopoly. We are only the best funded." A bell above made its opinion about time known. We waited for the last proud clang to fade and returned the ledger to its anonymity. In the doorway, he stopped me with a hand resting briefly on my chest, a gesture as priestly as any blessing. "Do not practice the rite alone," he said, as if the sentence had decided to become a prayer. "If you must, practice it on yourself only in whispers." What if the prayer practices on me in shouts? I asked. Then you will need friends with poor hearing, he said, and let me go. The day carried me through its assignments, and I did them the way a soldier peels a potato in a comedy to remind himself he is not a weapon. In the evening, the brother who tuned the organ asked if I would hold the light as he adjusted a pipe that had learned to be flat from a winter draft. I held it and watched him coax metal into obedience. It's not that it forgot the note, he said, wrench gentle, ear tyrannical. It remembered it too well and tried to sing it alike in every season. The pipe, corrected, surrendered a sound so clean it injured the air. I listened and thought, not for the last time, that music has been the Church's most innocent crime and its most plausible alibi. When the organ stopped, I returned to the lower rooms because motion had become my superstition, and the only place not moving was the one place that changes everything. The fresco had shed more dust. I brushed it again. The ladder refused to support my weight. It was paint, after all, not wood, not charity. In the scriptorium, Gnomon kept its temper. The chains draped its shoulders like jewelry worn by a widow out of habit rather than appetite. I did not touch it. I went instead to the charts and found a new note in ash blue, fresh, the edges of the letters still proud. On requests to publish concordance of Apocrypha for learned laity. Deny gently, offer summaries with corrected chronology. The handwriting had tired at the word gently. Mercy exhausts even its manufacturers. I closed the tube and sat on the bench with my ledger across my knees like a small, obedient animal. I said my name the given and the shadow under my breath, one after the other, until they began to braid themselves into something that felt like a rope I could hold while the sea decided my weather. I thought of the boy who had been returned to his I. I thought of Sister M.T., restored from confusion with a relic bearer. I thought of popes whose signatures were winter in June. I thought of famine, moved to shelter, a parade and plague sent south to keep the rumor of sanctity north. I thought of the ash blue and their vinegar hands, of Aurelius and his tenderness learned from an intimacy with scalpels, of the fresco dust and the horsehair stitches, and the quill that had learned my tremor well enough to pretend it was its own. I thought of the sentence I could no longer get out of my teeth. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. Then the lantern lowered its head. The room agreed to be night, and I heard the quietest sound a name can make when it decides to return to the person who has always failed to deserve it. I went back to my cell and slept like a man studying for a storm. They sent for me at an hour that refuses clocks. Not night, not morning, one of those slivers when sleep holds your wrist but not your hand. The knock was the kind that had already decided it would be forgiven. I opened to find Brother Severin, whose beard had learned resignation before any of us had learned Latin. "You've been copying the rubrics," he said. Not a question. "Bring your light." We went without words into a corridor that had memorized the feet of men who believed in function over grace. At the seam, I touched the T again habit, superstition, oath, and felt the fresh bite of chisel as if time were a mouth that kept its teeth sharp by recutting the same letter. The lantern remembered its profession and made a circle for us to stand inside. Severin carried not a candle, but a little tin box rattling with glass. He smelled of vinegar and of disappointment that had decided to keep working. The chamber was not the scriptorium, with its chained obedience, nor the fresco room with its polite dust. This room practiced usefulness. A table with a basin, a brazier, a shelf of stoppered vials the size of regret, a pillow that had given more ears a place to wait than any staircase ever would. On the wall, a drawing of a star chart, rewritten as a skeleton, ribs rendered as constellations, vertebrae as feast days, hips as eclipses, designed to keep history walking without a limp. The latter brand burned into the plaster near the threshold, descending as always, honest as ever about gravity. 3 people waited. Aurelius, hands folded like a manuscript that has agreed to be read. A woman whose hair was braided with the severity of someone who trusts knots more than men. And a boy, older than the child I had once overheard, refusing, younger than anything that should know the price of its name. He sat upright, jaw set, the illiteracy of pride learning a new alphabet. He did not look at me. He looked at the pillow as though it were a hill a soldier should take with his head. "Tell him," Severin said to Aurelius. Aurelius told the room, which is how he preferred to tell people. "This is not possession," he said, gentle enough to injure. "He is at odds with the name he was given, and the name has accrued habits that injure his sequence. He will not say birthday. He says arrival. He will not say home. He says the place where the sisters keep the keys." "What do you say?" I asked the boy, face still turned toward conquest disguised as linen. He spoke with the dignity of someone who would rather bleed than be corrected. "I say that the words they want make my mouth bristle. The story they give me wants to keep me quiet about parts of me that do not fit the homily." He flinched, not at any hand, but at the memory of one. "I cannot keep the chant in the right order when they say my name. My tongue makes another map." Aurelius nodded, grateful for the confession's craft. His parish priest sent him, "We will attempt the rite. We will not force sleep or spectacle. We will teach sequence politely." He turned to me. "You have copied the rubrics. You will assist by remembering that mercy is a verb." The table held the small ceremony of instruments, the quill whose flightless bird had contributed its innocence, the knife that would correct feather into discipline, the ink that had been persuaded from gall, myrrh, vinegar into something more docile than anger and more permanent than apology. Severin warmed the basin with the brazier and a candle that had not yet learned the heat of any Eucharist. The woman, Sister Lavinia, by the tilt of her posture, laid out the parchment squares and the horsehair in a gentle coil, question marks sleeping in its future. Aurelius began, not with prayer, but with listening, which is how real prayers begin. "Say your name," he asked the boy. Not unkindly, the boy said the syllables of a saint assigned him with the confidence of paperwork. The sound came into the room, looked around, and sat in the wrong chair. Aurelius heard it. I heard it. Even the basin heard it, water tightening on the surface like skin retreating from a cold hand. "What happens when they call you by that?" Aurelius asked. The boy swallowed something without a cup. "The chant trips. The room gets too bright in places that should be dim. The promises crawl into corners and turn their faces. I can speak, but it is not the kind of speaking that stores memory properly. It slides." He would have been a theologian, that boy, if word weather had been kind to him. Aurelius touched the quill to ink, lifted it to write, let the tip hover. "Birth name," he said to the ledger of air between us, and wrote it on the first parchment. He nodded for me to write the shelf marks, the time, the place. I did, hands behaving, heart making lists of exits. "Now," he said, "shadow name. There is a cruelty in the term. if you hear it with the ears of a man who has never been followed. Shadow name, in the rubric's grammar, is not insult but description, the shape the distortions wear when they think they have found a body to live in. It is how a fear spells itself when it wants male. Aurelius asked the boy to describe the places where the chant trips. He asked him what seasons his mouth thought it was when the parish insisted on winter. He asked who had been in the room the day the child learned he would be what a registry declared he had always been. The boy talked the way wounded men confess to water, one noun at a time, verbs keeping guard. Lavinia braided his sentences into notes with a speed that never looked like speed. Aurelius listened the way a surgeon's hand listens, for pressure, for breath, for any indication that the next cut would make or unmake a life. When he had gathered enough to pin the silhouette of the distortion to the wall, he wrote the shadow name. It was not theatrical. It was a rearrangement of letters that had always been there, a sliding of one consonant through a neighboring door, a vowel allowed to sit in a seat it had been refused. He wrote it, then wrote the birth name again below it, then laid the parchments face to face and stitched their margins with horsehair, each loop a question mark, each knot a breath. He placed the stitchwork beneath the boy's ear and leaned down to the room where names are held before they are said. "Origin," Aurelius whispered, voice trained not to be anyone's. Birthplace adjusted to where the sky met the child, without witnesses who confuse stars with signatures. Season, where the light did not embarrass your eyes. Witness, the woman who believed your breath belonged to you before it belonged to any gospel. Date, the day you remember the smell of rain, not the day the priest remembered the smell of oil. He paused between each adjustment, the way a man pauses at landings, when carrying something heavier than it looks. The boy's mouth changed, not shape posture. His lips learned a stance they had not been allowed. He breathed once, as if stealing. The basin listened. The water forgot to be a mirror. My ear, which had been a clerk for 2 years and a coward for a collection of lives, registered the first shift as the absence of grit in the hinge of a door you have trained yourself not to open. No demon flailed, no Latin wrestled, no spectacle applied for a job it could not perform. Sequence changed. The room annulled an arrangement that had called itself natural. "Say I," Aurelius asked, still not unkindly. The boy said it, and we all heard the consonant fall into place as if it had been waiting at a station for a delayed train. A breath later, he said his name. The birth name arrived first, and I braced for the wrong chair. Then the shadow name answered, not to correct, but to seat the earlier one properly. The two sat together, not twin, not masquerade. A braid that remembered both fibers were hair. Lavinia's eyes glossed not with tears. Tears are extroverts, but with the fatigue of someone whose craft demands precision under a law that refuses to admit kindness is a tool. Severin exhaled the way bellows exhale when a forge has become briefly safer than the room it heats. Aurelius lifted the stitched parchment from the boy's ear and placed it into the tin box Severin had brought. 7 nights, he said, under your pillow. Do not speak of it without need. Do not pray the prayer alone. Memorize the sequence aloud at dawn, when the world is forgetting or remembering itself. What if they call me wrong outside? The boy asked, not accusing, only rehearsing whether. Then answer with your name and your story, Aurelius said. The story is an organ. It holds air for you until you have breath. Later, you will not need the instrument as much. He paused and looked at me as if it were my turn to pronounce a sacrament no rubric would certify. Bring him to the stairs, Aurelius said. Let him feel the seam decide to be a seam, but not a wall. We walked. I carried no relic but the memory of vowels in their new seats. At the inscription, the boy reached up without prompting and ran his finger along the T. He frowned the way a craftsman frowns at a chair that looks sturdy but rocks. It's newer, he said. It is, I admitted. Someone recut it to keep the sentence standing straight. What did it say before? He asked. The same, I said, and felt the sin of precision. It was true, and it was a lie. The letters, age, hands, help them. He traced the V and the A with the reverence of someone meeting a word he has been threatened with and deciding it will be a friend if it behaves. I think I will sleep, he said, surprising himself with the permission. When he was gone, Severin scrubbed the basin with vinegar and a handful of salt like snow learning a job. Lavinia burned the quill to the ash ghost of itself. Aurelius poured the warmed water into the stone gutter that hungrily translated it back to the earth. The room unbuilt itself as if it had been a sentence that knew when to stop. After, he sat me down on the stool, where the instrument maker rests his spine between works. You felt the change? He asked. It was not a test, it was an inventory. I felt the room forgive something, I said. And then I heard, I find the chair. Good, he said. Now say your name. I did. The echo came not late, not early, but in step. There is a relief and a terror in being legible to yourself. I looked at the stitched parchments cooling inside Severin's tin and felt the indecency of recognizing family resemblance. You have been practicing, Aurelius added, because kindness prefers an accusation to a silence that might be misread. Only in whispers, I said. My mouth had the honesty of a child who has learned in which rooms lying is self-harm. The prayer practices on those who practice it, he replied with the professional sorrow of a man who has lost arguments to verbs before. He let me go, which is to say he trusted the stairs to tell me the rest. The scene tasted less of coins and more of rain. Servate Tacitum looked tired without its new T's arrogance, as if the other letters were yawning behind their stone posture. In the hallway to the scriptorium, I touched the gnomon spine like an apology a sinner makes to a confessional that still smells of truthful breath. It did not open. Good. I had no more room for victories. The day roped itself to chores: copy an index, correct a shelf mark, refuse a thought permission to declare itself conclusion. At the organ bench, the tuner returned with his wrench and an opinion about a pipe that insisted on singing yesterday into today. It won't learn, he said, peering down a throat of tin like a physician surprised his patient had hidden a hymn. It wants to be right in a room whose temperature has moved. He adjusted and swore a small litany reserved for craftsmen saints who forgive the hand more than the instrument. When the pipe surrendered, the note hung in the chamber so perfectly, I wondered whether perfection had ever done anything but frighten mercy into hiding. In the afternoon, a file found me. Files are extroverts among paper. They walk to the men they want. The cover read, De ritu nominationis novae, causae et casus, on the right of new naming, causes and cases. Inside, not the dramatic tragedies my appetite had been trained by stories to expect, but a series of almosts and barelys and a few that simply refused to move. Case 47. Renaming failed. Celebrant's voice intruded with history, not confessed. Case 89. Orthography corrected. Outcome improved. Orthography letters in order, like soldiers whose boots finely match. Case 112. Witness replaced by midwife's song. Subject recovered chant order. Witness replaced by song. I sat with that, and with the memory of the boy whose eye had found the chair by breathing into a room with fewer witnesses and more air. Aurelius returned, a shadow with appointments. "We will see an attempt that fails," he said, as if preparing me for a funeral. "You should learn what to do with failure besides call it scandal. There one mun know. Unsaw how of ver, a thing stew, on stew 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 stew, on stew." He had chosen a room smaller than the first, or perhaps the failure had shrunk the room. A woman older than the basin's patience, hands immaculate in the way of those who have been mistaken for dirt and decided to injure the accusation with cleanliness. Her given name tasted of a saint to whom miracles are assigned like unpaid bills. Her mouth refused it with a kindness I did not understand until she tried to sing. Her tune made right angles. She had learned to harmonize with herself because no one else had been allowed to. Aurelius went through the rite with the dignity of repetition. Birth name written, shadow name shaped like the truth hiding under a bruised peach. Parchments stitched with horsehair that already knew which knot would give and which would accuse the fingers. He set the stitched name under her ear. He whispered origin, a room with a window that had been painted shut, a witness who had taught her letters backward until the world allowed forward, a season in which the sun accepted the privacy of certain rooms. He waited after the seventh breath. "Say I," he asked, and asked again when the first one came out wearing a borrowed coat. She obeyed, but her "I" brought friends, a chorus, a choir of survival. The room shook only because my body did. She could not be returned with a single story. Her memories had rented apartments on every floor of the house, and each had kept the keys. Aurelius stopped. He removed the parchment with the courtesy you offer a guest who must leave early to make the last train. "We will not tear," he said. "We will wait." He turned to me. "This is boundary. It is placed by God or by grief. We call that mystery, and refuse to use the word to hide our failure. We will not pull more thread." He brought her to the seam anyway. He had learned that the stairs are therapists if you let them. She ran her fingers along the T and did not comment on the chisel's arrogance. She touched the V as if checking the pulse of a word. "I will keep the stitched names under my pillow," she said, but not as a promise, more like a treaty drawn between tired empires. When she was gone, he said to me what he had not said to her, because the room deserved the respect of not hearing a trade secret. Sometimes the rite fails because the celebrant is afraid of the story that would set the bone. "What story?" I asked. "The one that would make us change not the subject but the institution," he said. "We are better at editing men than we are at editing the rooms they are asked to fit." We walked back without speaking. In the scriptorium, a new note in ash blue had appeared, as if handwriting were a plant that grew where the sun didn't. On the concordance of renamings, "Do not publish. Circulate internally. Include guidance for confessors encountering chant disorder." Chant disorder. Someone had made a diagnosis from a symptom that had asked to be a song. I copied the note and found, beneath the chart of revised feasts, a little envelope sealed not with wax, but with an ambition that had dried. Inside, a single horsehair thread. No parchment, no name, just the tool, laid out like a relic of technique. I looped it once around my finger and felt its mild disdain for my skin. Tools have opinions about the hands they serve. I returned it to its paper and did not pretend to be its owner. Evening dressed the building from the outside inward. In the refectory, the soup remembered a recipe its author had never written down. Men praised the bread with the gratitude of those who consume without having to invent. I ate the way a man eats before a vigil, slowly, then hurriedly, as if the second half of your meal had forgiven the first. After, I walked alone to the chapel where the floor teaches knees that they are instruments, not ornaments. I sat and listened to the room breathe. The organ was quiet. The pipes stored air like kites waiting for a hill. I whispered the prayer, not to perform it, not to let it practice on me, but to remember the mouth shape of its verbs. Unknot, unglue, still. Somewhere between candle and stone, a sentence from the addenda jogged across my memory. When contradiction cannot be harmonized, leave room for mystery. I had despised the sentence earlier because it had been used as a broom. Tonight I learned to love its plea. Leave room. The right was a room. The seam was a room. A boy had been returned to his name because the room had been properly sized. A woman had not, because the room would have needed to be the world. There is no shame in admitting the world will not fit in your hand. Back in my cell, I took out the little square of scrap on which I had once written my given and shadow names, and burned it to keep my pillow from learning too much about me. The smoke smelled like the surgery of mercy. I slept, and in sleep the fresco ladder proved again it could not bear me. I climbed anyway, and woke with my calves sore from impossible rungs. At prime, Aurelius found me, and placed a folded paper in my palm. "Your confession," he said, which is not something a man wants to hear from another man who knows both the words' meanings. I opened it and found not accusation but instruction. When you feel your name wanting to become neat, tell it a memory with dirt on it. Names that stay clean too long become brittle. I went below because I always go below when told to think above. The scene permitted me. The scriptorium allowed. Nomen became scenery instead of actor. I sat with De Memoria Communi and made myself say out loud one of its sentences until it disgusted me enough to surrender the lesson. Relocate plague southward to preserve rumor of northern sanctity. I said it until the sanctity smelled like vinegar. Then I said my name, and this time it arrived carrying a basket of images that had never been allowed in any ledger. My mother's rough laugh, the one winter when the roof leaked, and we memorized the drip into the pan as if it were an antiphon. The taste of an apple stolen from a cart, and confessed as if theft were my vocation. The face of a man who had taught me the accusative case by accident when he yelled at me, and the grammar in his anger lined up my nouns like soldiers. Dirt. My name needed dirt. In the next days, there are days. Even underground, I assisted at 3 more rites. One that failed, like a song cut off mid-breath. One that succeeded, but only after the celebrant admitted a prejudice and left the room. So Lavinia could whisper origin without his voice colonizing the story, and one that did not so much succeed as refuse to be counted, a gentling of sequence that everyone agreed was sufficient, because the boy being helped decided he was tired, and kindness is sometimes content with exhaustion. Between rites, I copied. I copied until my hands' ache learned to mimic prayer. I copied through references to false popes whose rings were winter coats worn in June, through saints redistributed like furniture to a house with too many chairs and not enough rooms, through calendars softened into clay and shaped into bowls that fit mouths easier than clocks do. I copied until the ash blue taught my eye that doubt is a color, and then a habit, and then a discipline. And always the seam. I learned to touch the letters without asking straight questions of stone. Servate, tacitum, keep the silence. The tea still new, still arrogantly clean, still persuading the other letters to pretend they were a set. Some nights I loved the command, because the world above had become too loud. Some nights I disobeyed and told the seam all my names, arranged and misarranged, until the air forgot to enforce. The rite has a final instruction I had missed in the rubric's shadow. When the celebrant senses the prayer practicing on him, he will seek a witness who loves him more than his role. I understood it the night Aurelius found me near the basin with my forehead in my hands. He did not ask. He put his hand on my crown the way a father blesses and a surgeon hesitates. "You are not a tool," he said. "You are a man who has learned to hold one." "What if the tool keeps my hand?" I asked. "Then we give you a new hand," he said, "which is a joke or a promise or a suggestion that the church has more closets than the faithful suspect." He left the room before I could ask him which he meant. I looked at the basin and saw nothing of my face, which is how basins preserve you when they are kind. I turned and found the horsehair, looped once around my wrist like a penitent bracelet. It pricked. It did not puncture. The question marks it promised slept. I slept too that night, and dreamed not of names but of silence. Not the enforced kind, the other kind, where two people agree that breath is safer than speech until the thing between them learns to be alive. In that silence, a door opened that had always been painted shut. On the other side, not a secret, not a monster, not a ledger, a chair, and the word I, not spoken, but standing there, waiting for me to decide whether I would sit. The first time a map lied to me and I thanked it, I realized the ash blue had taught my eyes their accent. I returned to Inventarium 12, with my mouth set to confession, and my hands set to theft of knowledge, not of paper. The tubes stood like a choir of bones. I chose one with a wax plug impressed by a seal whose ring had learned winter long before the hand that wore it had learned death. The map sighed out of its skin and lay flat, continent by continent, with the resigned pride of old skin. If you have never watched coastlines refuse to agree with memory, you will not know the sensation the way trust turns into arithmetic. Here a monastery existed where none should, there a river braided backward into a sea that never asked for it. Margins muttered in ash blue, their verbs warm with the energy of men who believe tidiness is mercy. Consolidate, attenuate, harmonize. In the bottom corner, a tiny theater of dates moved by half-months and holy days to make a prophecy wave at a coronation that had always wanted applause. I traced a finger over a city I knew, because bread there tastes like patience, and the bells steal from each other's metal. The city's name sat in its usual chair, But the lanes ran without tripping. The line work had been corrected so that alleyways no longer confessed their crooked theology. A note: rectify plan for catechetical clarity. I had never considered that streets could be catechisms. Now I saw their rebellions had been reconciled by cartography. I leaned close, and the ink rose to meet me with the smell of vinegar, copper, and apology. Beneath the atlases of land, we kept atlases of time. Calendars bound as if they were atlases. Pages with latitude and longitude of weeks and fasts. I lifted one and felt the weight of seasons taught to click like cogs. The Julian gave way to the Gregorian, as iron gives way to filing, reluctantly. Then, with immodest smoothness, in the gutter of the binding, someone had written the softest sentence a man can use to call himself innocent. User experience improved. They had redesigned time for better user experience. I wanted to be angry enough to slam a cover and break a hinge. Instead, I measured. In the margins, I penciled distances between feast and comet, between eclipse and rumor, between plague and parade. I surprised myself by admiring some of the craft. Violence that calls itself surgery is still violence, but you can learn from the steady hand even as you forbid yourself the motive. When I had finished admiring my enemy, I remembered he lived in me, and I went to find a book I hoped would injure my admiration. De Pontificibus Substitutus. It hid as always among registers no one reads, unless they have decided not to forgive, spare veils for chalices, inventories of keys, lists of men who owed fasting days to a kitchen that keeps better records than God. The volume was smaller than a scandal ought to be. Inside, a ballet of continuities. There is a tone a clerk uses when he knows the city will burn if the ledger loses its spine. That tone wrote these entries. A winter signature carried into June by training the hand to shiver. Carriages at dusk, with curtains drawn, and the unfortunate necessity of a chin borrowed from a cousin. Rings that learned the biting pressure expected of them, even when the flesh beneath was not the flesh the ring had married. In the bottom left corner of one page, an ash-blue apology. On the doctrine of sign continuity, see Appendix, Theologies of Unbroken Thread. And there they were, the theologies we prefer when mercy is too noisy. The church is the garment. Popes are the stitches. The garment must not reveal the skin. Add stitches where the fabric thins. A footnote dared the reader to call this anything but love. It is a daring I have practiced refusing. I did not sense Aurelius enter, because sensing implies you have not already told yourself what you will do when you are caught. He stood a long moment without asking my posture to change. The worst lies, he said gently, are told because the truth got sick on a journey and someone needed a face to stand in front of the window. Does the window remember the face? I asked. The window remembers the weather, he answered. And weather is most of what people mean when they say God. He took the volume and placed it on the table with the delicacy of a man laying a body at the feet of a nurse, who forgives everyone but the disease. There is a concordance I want you to see, he added, and guided me into the narrow room with the fresco Jacob's ladder reversing perspective, rungs receding toward us with the arrogance of paint. The fresco had shed new dust. His sleeve learned charity as he brushed it to the sill. From beneath the same tile as before, he drew a codex that had the tired smell of books that have been used for noble mischief. Concordantia Vacatorum, he read. The concordance of the vacated. A registry of saints and their removal? No, not removal, I scolded myself. My mouth was starting to speak like them redistribution. Each entry a small liturgy of erasure disguised as hygiene. Here a saint excused for duplicating another man's miracle. There a patron unassigned to prevent an order of nuns from having too many birthdays to bake for. Look, Aurelius said, pointing to a page where the ink ash blue had swollen slightly, where a hand, perhaps his, had hesitated before pressing too hard. Not all vacatings are punitive. Some are prophylactic. Too many stories in one parish breeds competition, not reverence. We are shepherds. We separate rams before they break each other. And saints are rams, I said, the insolence not even bothering to dress for church. Saints are stories, he corrected, not offended. Stories need room to breathe. Otherwise, they faint and are called angels. I turned the page and met a name that had been the candle of my mother's plain altar, a woman who blessed kitchens and the men who had learned to avoid them. A small note, ash blue. Patronage shifted to regional variant to prevent duplication of feast with local saint of similar narrative. I felt something at my throat become steadily less obedient. How do we know the regional variant didn't learn her miracles from the woman you just rehoused? I asked. We don't, he said. We prefer to appear as though we do. We stood breathing the book's old breath. Somewhere above, the organ was learning or remembering a psalm. The notes slid into the stones and came back thinner, like soup after the landlord visits. I closed the concordance because I feared opening anything else would teach me to thank a hand I should refuse. Aurelius didn't ask me to continue. He had gotten what he wanted. The look in my face that told him a student had become an accomplice against his will. The day turned its wheel. I copied indexes with a steadier hand than my conscience deserved. At noon, which is a superstition under stone, a bell asked us to love the hour the way God does, equally, always, without preference. In the cloakroom, I found a folded slip with my name. Lavinia's writing, her letters sensible even when they were frightened. The council, it read. Tonight, you should see. Bring your conscience. You will need a second pair. I had never seen the ash blue meet. I had only heard their arguments talking through margins. I hid in the fresco room a quarter hour early, because fear likes to arrange chairs, and concealed myself behind a tapestry that smelled of wool blessed by moths. The ladder above me kept not falling, which is all one asks of a painted ladder. I breathed shallowly so my ribs would not advertise my profession. They came as people who do not think they are arriving. A cluster of men and one woman whose presence felt like a decision the room had made, not a permission anyone had granted. Astronomers with theology, written on their faces so that telescopes would forgive them. Theologians with their apologia worn like lab coats so that stars would pretend to be doctrine. One chemist, copper and vinegar haloing him like a secular saint. Aurelius last, the way good surgeons enter operations that are already underway. No names. Hands existed to hold papers, not to shake one another. Aurelius unrolled a chart on the table, the brittle sound of old paper waking. Item 1, he said, the plague. A map of regions north and south sulking at each other as always. Rumor has sanctity pooling in the north. We have witnesses, tunics, and a piece of bread that refuses to rot on schedule. The south has water that refuses to behave, and a bishop with a talent for grammar but not for bodies. The astronomer, the oldest one, tapped the map with a finger whose nails believed in providence. Move the plague southward 2 winters, Let the northern sanctity remain unchallenged while we find a story the South can marry without filing for annulment. The chemist folded his arms. Copper moved around him as if he were weather. And what of the dead? Their dates? Your 2 winters are a ledger entry. Their stones are stubborn. We leave stones to the stonemasons, the theologian murmured. We concern ourselves with the catechism of memory. Grief can be devout without being punctual. You will grow old explaining punctuality to mothers, the chemist replied, and I loved him for speaking as if vinegar were on our side. Item 2, Aurelius said before the heir discovered how to make an argument. Apparitions in the rural district of St. Clement. The testimonies contradict, which is a mercy, because it keeps us from printing what we cannot bless. Guidance for confessors? The woman, a scholar of something the Ash Blue had not named because they feared naming would make her necessary, spoke for the first time. Consolidate witness, she said. Let the poorest testimony become the spine. It has the least to gain from lying, and the most to lose from being tidied away. If vision persists, assign a prayer the peasants know by hand, not by book. Books teach apparitions how to audition. I would make you Pope, the older astronomer said, not quite mocking. But the ring might bite. Very respeeded. The divry divrint. Rings bite because they have to keep their teeth, she answered, and the table remembered it had been designed for arguments that don't end with a victory. Item 3, Aurelius said, and laid down the calendar like a surgeon laying out instruments. We are asked to correct a prophecy's awkward near fulfillment. A comet arrived 3 weeks late. A coronation needs a friend to stand in its photograph. Options? Adjust the fast, someone said. Move Pentecost by 12 days. Another, shift a saint's day with similar obligations to fill the gap. The woman again, or let the prophecy be a near miss and teach the people that God's aim is not arithmetic. And settle loin. Silence moved through them the way an education moves through a city, slow, offended, productive. Aurelius did not record a vote because votes are minutes, and minutes develop anniversaries. He folded the calendar and dismissed them with a blessing no one would admit to having received. The room exhaled. The fresco did not fall. When they were gone, I stepped out from behind the tapestry too quickly, as if my courage had not yet adjusted to light. Aurelius did not startle. Conscience brought a friend, he said. Good. This will require 2. You move plagues, I said. You move feasts, you move saints, you move popes. What don't you move? God, he said. And furniture too heavy for the stairs. Do you ever move back? I asked. When you are wrong. He rubbed a thumb over the ash dust on the sill and made 2 small piles become one. When we can afford to, he answered. We can afford to be wrong less often than I would like. You talk like a surgeon, I said. Forgive the body for bleeding. Blame the knife for its honesty. Reward the hand for not shaking. Bodies bleed less when the hand knows where the arteries are, he replied evenly. Do you propose we learn on the living? The fresco's ladder bent away from us like a spine taught fear. I wanted the room to argue on my behalf. It never does. The boy, I said instead, because the boy had become a syllable I could pronounce without hating myself. He learned I. The woman did not. Why? Because I rented 3 rooms and pays on time, he said. Because her town would need to hear her in order. Because the priest who sent her wants to be thanked, not instructed. He met my eyes and did not hurt me with his kindness. Because we are good at editing men, we are worse at editing the rooms that raise them. He sent me to another cabinet, a funerary of things you are not supposed to call alive. De Memoria Communi waited there, patient as weather. I opened to an entry I had copied and not forgiven. Relocate famine 2 years later to protect coronation from scandal of providence contested. Under it, a new line in ash blue new, because the ink was proud and unashamed. Revert partial adjustment in parishes where widows gather on the original date. Catechize gently. Allow grief its grammar. Someone had moved back. Someone had watched women refuse to relocate their dead just because a table had made room on another day. I wanted to love the ash blue for that sentence. Love is a habit that requires supervision. I closed the book before I started thanking the wrong men. That night, sleep came like a scribe too tired to ink a final flourish. I dreamt of an orrery, not the clean brass toys that make nobles feel intelligent, but an engine of stars whose gears were days and whose weight was names. Angels were not in it. Functions were. A gear labeled withholder of breath. Another, counter of dust. When one moved, the others obeyed with the reluctance of old laws. In the center, not a sun, but a hole where a sun would be if truth needed heat. I woke with cold in my mouth and a need to find a machine that belonged to men, not their dreams. The Orrery existed, not as I dreamt it, but close enough to shame me. Aurelius led me to a room I had not earned. A key whose bow was an eye turned sideways opened a door that had been practicing refusal for centuries. Inside, a ceiling so low even humility had to bow. On a pedestal, a model of time built by the arrogance of charity. Brass rings engraved with feasts, interlocking with rings cut for astronomical fact. A small crank allowed a human wrist to persuade heaven. When he turned it, the rings advanced, and we watched time yoke itself to doctrine like an ox promised better hay if it behaved. Comets could be dragged forward, eclipses made to stand politely, fasts adjusted to smile for a painting. It is a teaching tool, Aurelius said, defensive and proud, like a father holding a child who bit a neighbor and a dog in the same afternoon. It shows young canons how calendars serve not only God but people. It shows old canons how to make people serve calendars, I said. We spun it one more time, not for utility, but to punish ourselves. The rings clicked. Easter approached and retreated like a shy monarch. A saint's day slid into a harbor not built to receive it, and learned to enjoy the view. There, Aurelius said quietly, pointing at a notch in the brass where a ring had been forced once and never forgiven it. That is as far as we can go without breaking something no one can repair. Maybledding marks. What's on the other side? I asked. A story that will not marry ours, he said. We call that heresy because we are tired. We replaced the Orrery's dust cover with the care of men who know they are hiding evidence that will someday be adored. Outside, the seam tasted of rain again. I ran my thumb along the clean tea and imagined the man who carved it a brother with shoulders good for sacks, told to improve a letter because an earlier hand had gone soft. Did he resent the work, or did he love the cut? Did he think of future thumbs? Did he imagine mine? You cannot ask the dead to answer these questions. They already have. In the next weeks, the work did not change, only the distance between me and what I was doing. We renamed 2 more boys and a soldier who had forgotten his mouth's order after a battle that the ledger called successful and his bones called a riot. We failed a woman and gave her our patience instead of our skill. I recopied an index that had grown teeth. On the chronicles of false popes extract and distribute only the doctrine of sign continuity. Reduce other matter to internal training. I copied another entry that convinced me the ash blue had souls. When removing a saint, send a letter to the parish that adopted the saint's cat. Include money for food. Mercy wears costumes nobody applauds. And then the missing began. It started with a footnote. See also Chart 7 Monastery on the peninsula, and when I went to see, the chart was gone. Inventory said it had not existed. My own ledger held the shelf mark I had written, with a quill that remembered my wrist better than my face. I took the ledger to Aurelius. He took my face to the window and let the light check me for infection. Some charts wander, he said. Do they return? If called by their true names, he said. A sentence that is either magic or housekeeping. We called it. We wrote the shelf mark in ash blue. We said the date of the copy aloud. We described the mildew stain in the margin that looked like a lamb with an opinion. Nothing. The tube's place remained obediently vacant. A darkness with the posture of compliance. The next day, a saint went missing from the Concordantia Vacatorum. Not removed, erased. The line numbers marched on without a corpse. Typing error, Severin said. Dry as salt. He had never lied to me. Now he lied for me. As if lies work better when the person they protect knows what they cost. By the week's end, the false pope's ledger had a gap like a pulled tooth, the saddle of paper polished by absence. The Orrery room was locked by a key none of us owned. Aurelius's mouth developed the habit of halting in the middle of sentences that were not by nature halting. The ash blue met, and their voices sounded like minutes trying not to become history. The chemist was missing for 2 meetings. When he returned, he smelled not of copper but of the room they had locked from us. Where is Chart 7? I asked Aurelius, in a tone that had earned men less tolerant than him a winter outdoors. Redistributed, he said, and the word turned in my gut like a rounded stone someone had taught to have corners. We no longer require it to protect anyone's soul. What soul? I asked. The maps? Radioed. I do the jested ones. Yours, he said, and mine. In the cavern of that word, I understood that the institution had learned we were learning it. A teacher who realizes the student is studying the teacher's hands, not his lessons, either becomes a mentor or a guard. The ash blue were choosing. I began going above ground every evening, not to escape, but to inventory what air felt like in case someone edited it while I slept. On the 10th day of missing, I found a note under the seam, as if stone had been made to be a postbox. It was in the chemist's hand. When you cannot keep a ledger safe, hide your entry in a song. He had written a plainchant melody with the intervals arranged to spell a shelf mark. We sang it in the fresco room, Aurelius, Lavinia, Severin, and I, and the air, bored of being proper, pointed us to a cabinet that had disguised itself as a pillar. Inside, Chart 7, the peninsula defying, returned with a crease as if it had carried itself there on a back that had never seen kindness. We laughed quietly, the way men laugh in morgues when they find a ring that proves a name. The laugh turned into a cough when we unrolled the chart and found a new note in ash blue. Freshly proud, Peninsula confirmed, Monastery vacated. Saints redistributed. Keep the kitchen's cat fed. The chemist had betrayed his own counsel and saved our geography with a melody. I forgave vinegar all its crimes. After that, the Ash Blues meetings developed an odor. Not fear. Fear has a salt sweetness when men are brave. This was the iron tang of strategy. Item 1, I heard, concealed again behind a tapestry that was gradually learning my smell. Leaks in the lower rooms. Indexes discovered by men without vows. Item 2, rumors of false popes, amplified by a clerk with good Latin and poor self-preservation. Item 3, the rite of new naming being practiced without supervision. They had a file on me, or on the version of me that lives in all men who stop asking permission before they ask questions. Aurelius did not turn me in. He did not free me either. His kindness worked as a bandage and a leash. There is a last thing, he said to me one night. Sunlight confiscated, oil giving reports instead of light. You have read De Memoria Communi. You have learned its grammar of mercy and theft. There is a mirror to it, seldom opened and more carefully hated. De Oblivione, on forgetting. The book was thin. Forgetting, when done professionally, does not require abundance. Inside, a choreography of others vanishing, not executions, not even excommunications. A liturgy of neglect, where a name endangers continuity, recommend distance and silence, instruct confessors to avoid noun, emphasize verbs. When a testimony resists harmonization, change the room. The witness will follow the furniture. On men who will not stop asking, promote or send to the missions. I would prefer promotion, I said, and could not tell whether I was joking. You already received it, he said softly. We promoted you to knowing. In the mirror of that knowing, I saw a man walking toward a door with a key that looked like a sideways eye, and behind him a boy calling "I," and a woman refusing, and a map refusing to behave, and a chemist writing music with vinegar on his hands, and Lavinia braiding notes into rope, and Severin teaching basins how to launder after mercy. Behind them, the Ash Blue and their calendar engine, and a fresco that would never bear weight, and a ladder that told the truth about gravity. Behind them, and above them, roads corrected to teach children obedience, and saints moved to accommodate parishes, and popes who signed June with a January wrist, and famine moved for a parade and plague, rearranged to preserve rumor, and cats fed with church money. Because someone decided that kindness might be a sacrament if administered without witnesses. What do we do when the missing becomes policy? I asked. We memorize, Aurelius said, and we learn to tell out of order. When they edit the minutes, the story will still exist in mouths that refuse sequence. He put his hand on my shoulder, and the weight said what grammar could not. We would not be enough, and we would go anyway. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the chapel with the organ off and the wind pretending to be breath in the pipes. I recited the prayer to the one who unknots, the one who unglues, the one who stills the echo. I did not let it practice on me. I let it teach my mouth the shape of refusal that sounds like consent when it must. At dawn, which is a rumor and a sacrament, I wrote 2 names on a scrap, didn't stitch them, and held them under my ear without asking to be returned. Origin, I whispered to myself, a room where the story admits it is a room. I placed the scrap in the brazier and watched smoke learn to spell my sentences in a language only I would ever be forgiven for understanding. When I rose, the seam was there, letters tired, the tea still clean, a small arrogance cut into stone. I ran my thumb along it and said aloud what I had said only in my head. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. The corridor returned my voice without a sermon. Somewhere below, a cat I had never met ate church fish because someone had written a note that made kindness a line item. I loved us for that. I did not forgive us for the rest. And then, as if summoned by prayer or fatigue, a new door found me. It was not a door, it was a shelf that refused to be solid. My palm pressed a knot in the wood, and the knot remembered a carpenter with a sense of humor and rotated. Behind the shelf, steps. Not down, up. A staircase that climbed into a space I had always believed was merely ceiling. The air tasted of chalk and an old confidence. On the first riser, a word in ash blue, written sideways, so only those who disrespect gravity would read it. Archivum Caeli, the archive of the sky. I stood with one foot on the step and one on the floor and realized my body had become a sentence waiting for its verb. Down was what I knew. Up was where the missing go when the men who move calendars run out of basement. I climbed because stories prefer witnesses who move toward their worst suspicion. The stairs in the wall were not an afterthought. They were a decision the building had kept to itself. I climbed with the caution of a man who has learned that altitude is just another kind of secrecy. The chalk taste thickened. The dust changed from cellar to schoolroom. At the landing, a short corridor bent left, as if unwilling to present the room too quickly. I placed my palm against the plaster and felt, beneath the cold, a hum, not machine, not organ, something like bees rehearsing a theorem. The door was oak that had practiced being door longer than emperors practice crowns. No lock, only a latch, worn smooth by men who said nothing as they entered. On its lintel, a word in ash blue, faded to the color of breath on glass. Archivum Caeli, the archive of the sky. It is a boldness to claim heaven needs filing. It is a bolder thing to be right. Inside was not a dome with a telescope that begs forgiveness by praising stars. It was a loft of tables, laid out like constellations, each with instruments that preferred verbs to nouns. Brass azimuth circles. Quadrants with edges burnished by argument. A row of drawers labeled with months, as if the year were a cabinet that could be rearranged by hand. On the far wall, a fresco, not Jacob this time, but a sky whose constellations wore their old pagan names as aliases, while the Christian titles hovered beside them like legal guardians. Ursa flanked by Pastor, Cassiopeia shadowed by Mater Sapientiae. Between each, a hair-thin line of red that taught the eye how to move a story across a border without tearing it. A small orrery slept under a linen that had learned humility. I left it covered. At the center table, laid open with the grace of a wound, a codex whose vellum bore a sheen like skin that has forgiven winter. The title inhabited the first page rather than sat on it. De nominibus stellarum et eorum liturgiis, on the names of stars and their liturgies, not astrology, not astronomy, a grammar of how names apply to light. I turned a page with the delicacy of a thief discovering he is an heir. The first rubric was not a star chart, it was a premise. What the faithful call heaven is an index of agreements about light. Another followed. When the index is retitled, the agreements obey. I thought of the calendar engine below the crank persuading feast and eclipse to share a table. Here the persuasion worked in reverse. Rename the light, and the hours remember new hymns. The marginalia were, of course, ash blue. The hand was not Aurelius's. The letters stood taller, perhaps to see over the centuries, on shepherding the simple from Virgiliae to nativity signs, one note suggested, on persuading sailors that Arcturus need not contradict Michael's spear. The verbs were those of tutors patient to a fault: guide, acclimate, accompany, and beneath them, the sentence I had seen before, the sentence that had taught me to hear the world as a syntax. Veritas est syntaxis, potestatis truth is the syntax of power. At the back of the room, a narrow case held instruments I did not trust because they had the decency to be beautiful. Compasses balanced, as if each had rehearsed chastity. A gnomon tipped with a bead like a tear the sun had refused to drink. Between them, a drawer labeled Nomina Vacata vacated names. Inside, strips of vellum on which someone had written star names now retired. Lucifer, once morning star, now demoted to the devil's resume. Diane Lack, spilled and mopped into Queen of Heaven's veil. The notes were not triumphal. They read like condolence letters to the old world from a new one that could not afford to admit homesickness. I did not hear Aurelius enter again, because habit had taught my back the sound of him. He stood with his hands behind him, the stance of a man who would steal nothing and still be accused. "You found the attic," he said, "and let the room decide whether it wanted to forgive me for pronouncing its name." "I found the place where the sky learns its manners," I answered. He nodded. "The ash blue come here when stone grows impatient with calendars. Stars accept instruction better than kings." "Do they?" I asked. "Or do we teach the eyes to narrate obedience and call it astral?" He walked to the fresco and touched the paint lightly, not to test it, but to remind it of its job: remain. "There is a difference between renaming and reassigning," he said. "Renaming claims ontology. Reassigning claims itinerary." He pulled a drawer. Within, cards like liturgical flash reports. Comet. 1,490 seconds brought forward 11 days to kiss a prince's procession. Aurora borealis in strange latitudes, translated as choir of forgotten confessors. Teach peasants to kneel for weather. Occultation Saints' Day shifted to align with miracle that needed a door. Each card had 2 dates, 2 narratives, and a pencil check beside the one chosen. I thought of the chemist, of vinegar and copper, of a melody that spelled a shelf mark, of chart 7 hiding behind a pillar like a servant who knew the child better than the parent. "Why keep the old names?" I asked, holding one of the vacated vellums. "If the new story stands, why keep the corpse of the previous?" "Because we are not magicians," he said. "Magicians cut their assistants in half and throw away the part that bleeds. We are clerks. Clerks file the part that bleeds in case the bishop asks for it later." I laughed, and the laugh sounded like resignation mine or the room's, I could not say. "Do you pray here?" I asked. "We pretend we don't," he said. "Then we do." We opened De Nominibus to a section titled with the frank blandness of a doctor's note, De Ritu Translationinis. On the right of translation, it described not tongues of men but mouths of stars. When a star is preached under a new patronage, its procession shall be adjusted so that shepherds and sailors, who remember more truly than princes, learn without falling. The rite called for a candle untouched by the sacraments, a basin warmed the way I had seen Severin warm it before a naming, and a psalm sung off-key by a single voice, so that the harmony did not persuade men it was miracle. At the bottom, the warning the ash blue never tire of, do not pull more thread than you can weave back. I turned the page and found a fold, a pocket stitched closed with horsehair. There, again, the question marks of tight knots. Aurelius watched me with the attention of a teacher who has decided to let a student fail only if failure will graduate him. I unpicked one knot, then another. The horsehair had memory. It yielded where it wanted reproach and resisted where it wanted mercy. Inside the pocket, a square of vellum, thinner than debt. On it, a map that was not a map. A ring of constellations cut from their pagan names and reseated in a litany of angelic functions, the one who unknots, the one who unglues, the one who stills the echo, the same functions as the rite of renaming souls. As above, so your mouth, the vellum implied. As below, so your sky. I felt, stupidly, the tears that never volunteer around books. Not grief, its quieter cousin, recognition. You stitched heaven to the Codex, I said. You sewed the rite into the ceiling. Heaven stitched us first, Aurelius replied. We only taught the seam to lie flatter. We worked in silence. By worked I mean we stood and let the room tell us what it thought we could bear. In the right-hand case, tucked where men who hurry never look, a thin ledger labeled De Syntaxi Veritatis, on the syntax of truth. I opened it because I have the vice of wanting to know the grammar of what injures me. The entries were brief and righteous. Move the comma, condemn a different king, change the subject, absolve the institution, replace the agent with the passive voice. Accidents increase their charity. When the saint performs the miracle, the artisan disappears. When the artisan is credited, the miracle is relocated to interior provinces. I copied 3 lines into my head and felt them file a complaint. Aurelius closed the ledger with the tenderness of a man folding a child's shirt. We have been found, he said softly. He did not mean by God. Lavinia stood in the door, breath polite, eyes unalarmed the way soldiers' eyes learn to be. They took Severin, she said, not by force. By invitation he could not decline. The council has asked him to account for the basins. I gripped the edge of the table and learned again the lesson of wood. It forgives fingers their confessions. For the right? For laundering after, she said. They suspect he keeps the water too honest, and the screwed. Aurelius moved past me with a speed only love achieves within men who have trained it to kneel. You will stay, he said to me, and you will read. It was either a promotion or an exile. Lavinia gave me a look that translated to a psalm. Wait and know. Alone, I opened drawers, not to plunder but to memorize. In one Psalmi Signati Psalms, whose intervals had been assigned shelf marks the way a mother assigns nicknames her children pretend to hate. In another, Calendaria Inversa, rehearsals of the days as they would be if no one objected to the truth's inconvenience. I traced with my finger a calendar that placed famine back where widows had kept it, and a plague where the mills remembered silence. The pencil ticks beside those entries were faint. as if hope had been carried into the room on the hem of someone's coat and brushed off before anyone could see. Footsteps 2 sets returned. Aurelius came first, Severin behind him with hands no man had tied and eyes that had learned to untie themselves. He sat on a stool and let his weight notify the wood. They wanted a confession, he reported. I gave them a method. They will decide which it was. What did you give them? I asked. The recipe for vinegar, he said, half grin, half spasm. And the hymn that spells where we hid, chart 7. They congratulated me for protecting geography with song. He looked at Aurelius. They will come for the basins. They will claim sentiment makes water unreliable. They will claim sentiment makes witnesses reliable, Aurelius corrected, which resembles justice when pronounced with the right vowels. Lavinia shut the door, set the latch, and moved toward the center table with the gentleness of someone scolding a flame for behaving like fire. They've moved the Orrery room key, she said, and a gap has appeared in Concordantia Vacatorum where a saint once had a cat. The kitchen is out of fish. In the scene done, we did not laugh at that, though the temptation was honest. Every institution is at its best in small mercies, and at its worst in large ones. Aurelius placed in my hands a sheaf tied with string that had learned the art of surrender. If they edit us, he said, this is the grammar they will use. Learn it until you can smell its verbs in a dark room. The title was plain as bread, Manual for Harmonization. Inside, the steps by which testimony is made to married doctrine without scandal to either. Remove the names of women who heard first, unless it is Advent, in which case conceal them inside prophecy. Convert trades to sacraments, where possible. Blacksmith to miracle of incorruptible iron. Midwife to relic translation. Sailor to pilgrim. Time the thunder to the line, where repentance enters the homily. Place the king's procession under an obedient star. Above all, teach the story to arrive at the hour the bells prefer. I read until the verbs in me mutinied. Severin brewed a small pot of something that reminded my mouth of Mercy's poverty. Lavinia took up the quill and extracted from the Psalmi Signati 3 chants, whose intervals could ferry messages without a bishop hearing it as treason. One for a date, one for a shelf mark, one for a warning. We send them to the parishes that still keep widows' calendars, she said. We ask them to memorize a tune. If the tune changes, they will know a famine has been moved. Aurelius watched me and waited for my mouth to ask what my bones already knew. You want to publish, I said. Not with ink, with people. Minutes can be edited, he said. Mouths that sing out of order cannot all be summoned to Rome. Severin set the steaming cup before me. Careful, he said. It's prayer temperature. We began, in that room where Skye learned grammar, to invent our own. Lavinia composed the first chant, a narrow melody, unremarkable enough to pass through a bishop's ear without being invited to supper. The intervals spelled a shelf mark for De Memoria Communi. The second chant, named the Day Widows, refused to move. The third was not a chant but a whisper. We decided to teach to children because children tell the truth by accident. If the saint's day moves and your bread goes stale, sing yesterday until the air remembers. There is a kind of planning that makes men feel heroic. This was the other kind, the kind that makes you feel you are only worthy of being caught. Aurelius did not let us pause in that self-disgust. We do not need to win, he said. We need to return enough commas that a boy can say, I, and a woman can keep 3 rooms, and bread can go stale on schedule. Related. We sent the chance out the way smugglers send fruit, in baskets that owed taxes to no one. A friar who owed Lavinia a debt took the first two to a parish where the organist could not read, but could remember. A lay brother with a talent for forgetting official routes walked the third to a convent that kept cats alive longer than saints. Severin stood at the window with his elbow on the sill like a man who has never looked dignified and chose tonight to try. Then the ash blue decided to be efficient. A notice appeared at Prime, posted without signature but with the politeness of a hand that had never been refused, on the consolidation of lower archives to protect against damp and disorder. All basins to be inventoried, all charts to be reconciled against the register of apostolic narratives, all keys to be returned for study. The word that entered me like a nail was not consolidate, not inventory. It was reconciled. Reconcile is a verb, soft enough to hide knives. Aurelius brought us to the fresco room because that is where men go when they want to feel the shape of their own refusal. We will not stop them, he said. We will stand where they do not expect to find a wall. Lavinia placed her hand flat on the painted ladder and left a print of dust that looked like a blessing that had mislaid its object. Where? She asked. The seam, I said. And the kitchens. Severin smiled like a man who had been restored to himself, enough to consider treason a sacrament. We will let the widows speak, he said. They reconcile nothing. Our plan, if one dignifies the sequence of our hands with that word, was simple, because we were not clever men, only stubborn ones. The ash blue would move the basins. We would label them wrong so that water learned to return to the rooms where names could be practiced without supervision. They would reconcile charts. We would replace one legend in 10 with our fatigue, which looks enough like ink to pass muster until a boy sounds it as a psalm. They would call for keys. We would give them those that open rooms that smell of boredom and keep those that open doors that smell of chalk. They would ask for a list of rights. We would give them the ones that fail and teach the ones that work to refuse noun and accept verb. We worked 3 nights, then 4. Sleep learned to wait on the landing like a faithful dog. At matins, the choir sang too well. I resented them for practicing obedience while we practiced memory. In the scriptorium, Nomen behaved like furniture. I loved it for being inert in a room that wanted to move. In De Memoria Communi, someone had added a line I had not seen, a penitent addition in ash blue. Where correction has harmed the poor, confess it in a homily before adjusting the ledger. Someone in the council had learned. Someone had written an apology into doctrine without asking permission. On the 6th night, the Archivum Caeli heard us. The hum under the plaster rose to a tone. The fresco did not fall. It lifted a little, as if consideration could be a physics. When we entered, the orrery under its linen had shifted on the table by the width of a confession. I lifted the linen edge. The crank sat in its little crater like a man waiting to be tempted. On the ring for fasts, a new notch. Not theirs, ours. A place where Pentecost could sit if widows refused to move their dead. Bold, Severin whispered, meaning stupid. Aurelius turned the crank a fraction. The ring accepted the notch. The machine did not cough. We had added mercy to brass. That is an unforgivable sentence. I am telling you because the truth requires us to confess not only our enemies' sins. They discovered us the following afternoon, not in the attic, not in the basins, not in the chants, in the kitchen. The cat, the one the concordance had once paid for, lay on the table as if employed. The notice was pinned above the hearth. On the proper feeding of animals consecrated by narrative. Suspend stipends until saints' days reconciled. The women laughed with the derision of veterans. They fed the cat anyway. They sang Lavinia's tune while they burned bread to mark a famine the register had moved and they had not. That is how the council learned we were publishing in Flour and Fish. Aurelius was called to answer. He went with the gravity of a man who has practiced having his words arrested. Lavinia and I stood in the doorway of the fresco room, while the latter pretended it was not listening. Severin sat with his back against the seam, as if letters could choose sides. We waited the way night waits for men to admit they are tired. He returned with his hands empty and his eyes holding a new perimeter. They will reconcile the reconciliations, he said. They will take the Orrery. They will ask me to retire the rites to a smaller room. What will you do? I asked. But what I meant was, what will we be? Teach the smallest room to be large, he said. He looked at me, at my mouth, at the way my throat had learned to host a prayer it did not own. And you, he added, will learn to say it out of order. The council set the date. Consolidation. Keys returned. Basins numbered. Charts reconciled. Orrery removed for study. They gave us 7 days, which is an old joke and a hard mercy. We spent 6 doing what you already know. Memorizing, mistranscribing, singing, braiding notes into rope, leaving the horsehair thread in places where only hands that had bled would think to look. On the 7th, Aurelius asked for a night. What kind? I asked. The kind where a man learns the price of a comma, he said. We went to the oratory where confessions sound like oceans and shells. He carried a parcel the size of reluctance. Inside, the folios stitched with horsehair, the ones that belong to Nomen, the rogue leaves of the Codex, the ones that press names and their shadows together until one sits properly and the other learns to be a story instead of a jailer. The council had not found them because they had been hiding inside the priest, who would have surrendered them only if he had been asked in the voice he reserves for God. Nobody had. I should burn them, he said. I should hide them where only rain can read. I should put them back and pretend the room ate them. What will you do? I asked. Ask you to help me be edited, he said. We set the folios on the kneeler. The candle became surgical again. The room, which has opinions, decided to be a witness. He placed one stitched name under my ear. Say it, he said, not my given, not the shadow, the name the prayer had once suggested without consent. I said it. It did not taste like theft anymore. It tasted like the mouth of someone who has learned to stop telling the editor what story he is in, and instead starts to tell the truth until the editor calls it impossible and goes to bed. Listen, he said, and spoke an origin not of doctrine, not of birth certificate, but of craft. A desk, a basin, a boy refusing eye, and being restored without applause, a woman who found 3 rooms and refused to leave any, a chemist who set maps to music, a seam with a T too clean and letters too tired, a fresco that would never hold weight, and a ladder that taught gravity better than any bishop. Sequence, he finished, is a kindness when it tells the truth. When it lies, tell it backward. Let the memory return unruly. We can smooth later. Tonight we need the mess. I wanted to cry, which is a sentence I have written too rarely and felt too often. We returned the folios to the parcel. He tied the string with a knot that resembled patience. Tomorrow, he said, They take the orrery. Tonight, I said, we move the comma. We did not sleep. We took the chants to the kitchens. We gave the psalm to the widows. We placed a horsehair thread under the edge of the seam so that anyone with the vice of touching letters would prick a finger and remember that blood is an index. We left a note in the concordance, ash blue and shameless. When you remove a saint, we will feed what she left. We put our palms on nomen and promised not to let the hand that loves verbs forget that nouns are bones. We went to the archivum caeli and lifted the linen and kissed the crank. Not because we are superstitious men, but because men who have learned to edit must sometimes kiss the instruments they are ashamed to own. At dawn it was dawn because the birds decided to publish it. We stood at the seam. Servate tacitum kept its old command. The T kept its new knife. I placed my thumb on the blade and let it remind me that quiet has two parents, reverence and fear. Aurelius stood beside me, a man who had learned to bless and to cut with equal competence and equal sorrow. Lavinia breathed like a metronome you trust. Severin held a basin with nothing in it and infinite capacity. They will come, he said. They have always, I replied. And you? Aurelius asked me. Not about the council, not about the Codex, not about the sky. I will tell it out of order, I said. I will teach the commas to wander until boys can sit where their names refuse them, and widows can keep the calendar, and cats can eat fish on days saints used to belong to, and kitchens can sing famine back to where it was, and the seam will stop pretending the tea belongs to the same century as the rest. The room heard me. The building decided it could sustain the weight of that arrogance for one more day. We went down, not up, and waited for men who prefer moving furniture to changing the house. The archivum caeli behind us hummed the way a mother hums when the child cannot sleep. Not with miracle, only with refusal to stop. Tomorrow they would take the orrery. Tomorrow we would let them. Tomorrow I would climb the stairs I had once believed only went down, and discover whether the sky keeps an index of men who have learned to be edited without being erased. But tonight we rehearsed the grammar of our disobedience, and the candle agreed to make a small, correct light without asking to be a sun. They came at midday because thieves and saints prefer dawn, and administrators fear the symbolism of either. The notice had given us 7 days. The 7th arrived with the confidence of a bell that thinks volume is a virtue. The council's men wore the uniform of tidy verbs: reconcile, consolidate, return. The smell they brought was not violence. It was caution powdered with assurance. We met them at the seam, because that is where the building tells the truth, even when the men inside practice other virtues. The youngest among them, Cheeks, still deciding whether to be devout or merely obedient, ran a finger over the T of servate tacitum and smiled, not at the command, but at the cleanliness of the chisel's bite. Men love new letters. Old ones love men who remember. Keys, the leader said, hand out with the audacity of function. Aurelius laid down 3 rings of metal, the way a father places tools on a bench he knows will be misused. Without melodrama, with the grief that respects itself by staying quiet. We kept none that would get a boy killed. We kept all that would keep a memory alive. The basins, another said, as if water were a department and not a theology. Severin gestured to the inventory we had arranged with tenderness and malice. Numbers were correct, names were not. The trick with mislabeling mercy is to do it so neatly. Even kindness needs spectacles. And the Orrery, the leader added, pausing, because the mouth that speaks that word learns it belongs to rooms that notice posture. It will be moved for study. Study, Aurelius repeated, the syllables tasting of copper. You will learn what brass does when it is asked to carry more God than it was promised. In many Becretia, they brought a cloth sling like a funeral that needed to look like housekeeping. The crank sulked under linen. 2 men lifted. A third spoke a psalm with the boredom of a child who has traded wonder for punctuality. As they departed, the room's hum altered by a note you don't hear so much as lose. The Archivum Caeli stood with the composure of an altar stripped for Good Friday. Stripped altars do not weep. They maintain a dignity too old to perform. Consolidation, the notice had said. Consolidation is a polite word for teaching rooms to forget their habits. We followed them down not as wardens or mourners, but as witnesses, which is the job angels are given when men think angels are unemployed. In the scriptorium, the chained books kept their jewelry and their anger. Nomen sat as though a spine could hold its breath. We waited for the council to ask us to bless what they had already decided was holy by virtue of being inevitable. There is a procedure for removing an engine from a theology. They performed it with a competence that offended without requiring objection. Lists read aloud. Signatures affixed. An oath that substituted nouns for guilt, the object, the instrument, the device. So no one had to say the way we persuade time. They placed the Orrery on a cart whose wheels had never before rolled anything heavier than doctrine. The cart complained honestly. The men blamed Stone. Who will speak for the widows? Lavinia asked, voice even. Forehead steady, hands a city where patience owns the property. The leader looked up with the incomprehension of one who knows widows as a budget line. The parishes have been informed. And the kitchens? Severin said, tilting the ledger so his words caught the light. Bread knows when famine has been moved. It molds late, it tells the truth with appetite. Order improves the appetite, the leader replied, failing to hear his own blasphemy. The procession reached the seam. The cart stuttered. The T in the inscription glanced the wheel as if Stone had a finger, and the wheel shivered like a man reminded of a boyhood bruise. Mind the step, I said, to the wheel, to the men, to the hour. They minded nothing. They crossed. The Orrery left the rooms that had taught it how to breathe. We did not follow farther. Aurelius dismissed the council with a blessing large enough to make a small mockery of their certainty, and small enough to avoid scandal. When the corridor had digested them, we went to the kitchens because that is where revolutions feed themselves or admit they are plays. The women had learned Lavinia's tune so thoroughly, the rafters had secretly started to hum back. A pot of fish stew minus the fish we refused to account for, boiled like a rumor that intended to keep its promises. Sing, Lavinia said, and the insult in the order was mercy. We were being asked to do the job that always saves us last. We sang the shelf-mark chant first, the one that hides De Memoria Communi in an innocent melody no bishop can be bothered to hate. Then the Widow's Day, the tune that refuses to move a famine even as the minutes insist on new anniversaries. Finally, the whisper we taught. Children, spoken rather than sung by the oldest among us, so it would settle into the wood. If the saint's day moves and your bread goes stale, sing yesterday until the air remembers. The air remembered. Not with miracle, not with violence, with a recalibration of courtesy. Pots boiled at the pace of hunger, not of policy. A child in the corner mouthed the chant as if practicing a letter he couldn't yet draw. A cat, under the table, licked its paw with a liturgical concentration. We returned to the fresco room to find the latter shedding dust at a rate that made me consider the architecture of signs. Aurelius brushed the powder into his palm and distributed the blessing thinly along the sill, as if preparing a room to receive a sacrament we had not earned. "We will be asked to confess," he said. "We will not be asked to testify. He has a gift for sentences that must live in heads that cannot afford to be written." "Confess what?" I asked. "That we knew the grammar by which they improved us," he said. "That we helped where we could. That we did not prevent what was heavy with inevitability." "And testify to what?" Lavinia added. "Eyes on the rung that refuses weight." "That memory keeps a different calendar when it is poor," Aurelius answered. "That a boy sat properly in his name without asking permission. That a woman refused to move rooms just because the men who collect rent think square is more Catholic than round. That a chemist taught maps to become choirs, and the choir memorized a shelf mark. That a cat ate fish on the day a saint used to hold a parish, and the parish fed the cat because kindness knows more doctrine than any counsel." "Will they arrest us?" Severin asked. "Not frightened, just inventorying the usual." "They will promote us," Aurelius said, "or send us to the missions, or make us younger on paper until our questions look like accidents of youth." He was not wrong. The summons arrived like weather that pretends to be a letter. Not prison, not censure. A committee on consolidated ethics of memory. The names of attendees looked like a body performing its own autopsy. Aurelius, recalled to a higher room. Lavinia, seconded to correct catechetical materials for rural parishes with seasonal confusions. Severin, appointed to compliance of instruments. And me, copyist without seniority, invited to the office of harmonization as if my hands had earned a salary for editing that had cost me appetite. "Take it," Aurelius said, reading my face without requiring it to speak. "They are inviting you into the machine at the speed where you will be tempted to forgive it." "And refuse?" I asked. "They will call it zeal," he said. "They will send you where chance do not carry as far." I took it because he knew I would, and because refusing would have felt like virtue when what we needed was proximity. The office lived 3 courtyards away, in a wing that looked harmless by design. The room they gave me had windows trained to pretend Rome is an idea painted on air. On my desk, Manual for Harmonization, the same sheaf we had studied in the attic, now wearing a seal. The difference between outlaw and policy is usually a string. They gave me a stack of testimonies, to marry without scandal. I read the first, a girl who saw light, where men had instructed darkness to be productive. The second, a miller whose wheel stopped on the day a bishop died. The town assigned grief to hydraulics and relief to miracle. The third, an old man who began singing the wrong psalm on the right day and refused to stop even when corrected by someone who had softened time sufficiently to pass. Each packet came with instructions already written in the margins by a friend with ash-blue hands. Consolidate, translate, reassign, reduce. I was to make them tidy without leaving blood on the floor. I did not make them tidy. Not our first day. I inserted commas where periods had been ordered. I reintroduced witnesses replaced by abstractions. I allowed a season back into a sentence that had decided it could afford to be weatherless. I practiced the discipline Aurelius had given me. Tell it out of order until the order that remains is the one mercy uses when she does not want applause. They noticed, not admiration, not reprimand. The kind of notice that writes your name in a ledger under monitor. A man with vowels marble had used first, leaned over my desk with the smile of someone who has never been told no by an instrument. We prefer the passive voice for events of uncertain provenance, he said. It fosters charity. The SMI tending toward whom? I asked. Toward institutions, he answered, with the confidence of a man who knows where the money sleeps. At night, they moved the orrery again this time, not for study, but to a room whose walls practiced forgetting. We followed, because men who edit calendars cannot resist an engine that makes arithmetic confess to art. The crank judged us and found us insufficient. The new rings had a polish that told me hands had been trained to say inevitable until brass believed the word. On the fast's ring, the notch we had filed for widows had been buffed until it resembled patience rather than defiance. Try it, the marble-voweled man said to me the way a father hands his son a tool after the blade has been dulled out of love. I turned the crank a fraction. The machine obeyed. Easter slid 1 degree. An aurora adjusted its manners. My hand remembered the ratchet's older confession. The click that meant here is as far as we can go without breaking what cannot be repaired. That click was softer now. Repair had been redefined as conformity. I returned to my office, which is to say, my cell with daylight, and the stack of testimonies that believed in romance before marriage. The manual weighted like a conscience you can misread into mercy. I wrote 2 versions for each story, one tidy enough to pass, one human enough to survive. The tidy version went to the ledger. The human one I copied into a notebook bound in the color of doubt and slid it into a space between the inner wall and the cabinet where wood meets stone and admits allegiance to neither. I told myself I was not publishing. I was remembering in advance. Lavinia's letters arrived in a grammar that would disappoint a censor. She used the wrong salutations, addressed me as if we were heretics of appetite rather than doctrine, and filled the margins with recipes for chants that look like canons only to women who have buried husbands before the church learned the date. Widows were singing. Kitchen girls were teaching boys to misplace a feast by humming what the calendar refused. Bread was molding on schedule. Cats were still employed. The council expressed gratitude for compliance in rural districts. Gratitude is what institutions send when their thirst has been quenched by wells they did not dig. Severin's reports were shorter. Basins relieve themselves of names. Water refuses ministry when mislabeled. Vinegar remembers he would never be promoted. He had already made his vows to gravity. Aurelius's notes, when he found time to send them, arrived like weather. One line, capable of growing a storm. We were right to keep small tools. Or, tell it backward when you are asked to prove you were present. Once, only, if they ask for me, say I am with the widows. The sentence obeyed multiple tenses. The council's next consolidation was sudden, which is how politeness performs inevitability. On the correction of catechetical materials showing irregularities of sequence, on the indexing of chants to authorized melodies, on the redistribution of saints to prevent duplication of reverence, the trifecta that had taught me what the machine loves most, quiet that looks like order. They did us the favor of being clumsy. Parishes noticed. A letter came from a town we had only managed to visit with song. We will keep the old day. Our bread knows. Our river too. Rivers keep better records than bishops. There is a climax in every story that decides whether it will become history or be retitled rumor. Ours came in a room with no fresco and a table that had never learned grief. The Office of Harmonization convened around my tidy versions, not my human ones. On page 3 of a testimony from a village that believes fatigue is the Holy Spirit's favorite disguise, a margin appeared in ash blue I had not written. Accept the variant. The boy sits properly. The woman keeps her rooms. I looked up. Across the table, the chemist could not meet my eyes. His hands smelled of copper and apology. He had joined them, or they had borrowed him. I could not tell which verb owned his bones. "Who wrote this?" the marble man asked, not angry curious in the way a butcher might admire a violin. No one confessed. That is how you know a conspiracy has matured. Confession is replaced by craft. We voted not with raised hands, with altered drafts. The margins survived. On 3 other pages, variants were accepted over harmonizations, pretending to be kindness. Somewhere, perhaps everywhere, a widow's day breathed a little easier. We had placed commas where periods had demanded to live. We were losing, and we were winning enough to confess the difference between despair and accuracy. I did not sleep the night they arrested the cat. This is not a joke. They did it by accounting. Suspend stipends until reconciled days are observed. The cat, unconcerned with stipends, ate a mouse and reminded a parish that economies cannot edit hunger. The parish wrote a song that spelled a shelf mark with its intervals and sent it to us on paper that smelled of stew. On the morning the council announced closure for renovation of the Archivum Caeli paint damage, damp in the ceiling, the usual ailments truth suffers when it sleeps. In old rooms we decided to do what Aurelius called the only honest burglary. We would not take the Orrery back. It belonged to the men who needed it more than we did. We would take the names, the vacated vellums from the drawer labeled Nomina Vacata, and carry them where chance travel. We would give Lucifer back to the morning star. In songs that teach children dawn belongs to their lungs. We would let Diana's milk spoil back into goddess, and then be translated again by women whose hands wash altars before men have found the keys. We would return functions to angels, so that when sailors asked for Michael, the spear would point to an actual reef. Aurelius unlocked the attic with the sideways eye key. The room recognized us with a hum that had forgiven without forgetting. Lavinia slid the drawer free with the competence of a thief, overqualified for honesty. We took not all, never all. Editors and burglars share this ethic, but enough to remind the sky of its aliases. Wrapped in cloth that had learned the smell of prayers, the vellum strips felt like thin bones. Severin tucked them into a sack a farmer would mistake for lunch. We were not stopped. That is the worst kind of fear, the kind that keeps its manners. In the kitchens, we divided the names like bread, one for the river parish, one for the miller with the honest wheel, one for the convent where cats keep rules better than priests. Each received a song and a strip and a sentence. When you hear a sermon that makes your hunger behave too well, sing this name quietly until the bread remembers it is not a metaphor. That afternoon, a final summons. Aurelius to the council, not promotion, not missions. The room that had always reserved the right to call kindness rebellion. We accompanied him to the seam because friends carry men to doors even when they are not permitted to cross. "If they ask me to confess," he said, I will tell them what I know. If they ask me to testify, I will tell them what we did. If they ask me to repent, I will tell them the rite failed when the institution refused the story that would set the bone. And if they ask you to be neat, I said, I will bleed, he answered, without romance. He turned to me. Say your name. I said it the given first, then the shadow we had once stitched to make a chair for the first. They arrived together, not twins but roommates, who had learned to share a kitchen. He smiled the way men smile when they discover their craft has not made them cruel. Tell it out of order, he said. When they write minutes, they will have to choose which sentence to misquote. He left at midday. The building pretended not to notice. The kitchens sang the widow's tune under their breath, while over their breath they negotiated soup. Severin taught a basin how to stand empty without becoming clean. Lavinia sharpened a quill until the feather remembered it had once been a wing. I sat in my office with sun performing competence and wrote 2 versions of the story you are reading. The tidy one is the minutes. The human one is what I am about to ask you to carry. Aurelius did not return before Compline. He did not return before Prime. A messenger came with the smile of a man who has been paid to look plausible. Reassignment to a house with fewer stairs and more windows. Consultation on rites that trouble rural districts. Health sufficient for prayer, insufficient for travel. The words were true enough to blush. We set a place for him at table and left it empty. It is the kind of hospitality we can afford. I visited the Orrery room once more because grief memorizes roots. The crank was gone. The rings remained under glass. On the fast's ring, our notch had been replaced with a jewel, a pretty apology for a function retired. I pressed my finger to the glass the way men touch relics when they are unsure they deserve favor. The glass did not warm. The ring did not move. My face looked like a clerk who had stolen verbs and found nouns waiting with a warrant. I walked the stairs down and touched the seam, and read the command aloud because stone appreciates effort. Servate tacitum, keep the silence. Then, against the T's clean arrogance, I said what I had not allowed myself since the day I opened Nomen with the back of my hand and felt prayer try on my mouth like a winter coat. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. The building did not argue. Buildings rarely do when men have learned to tell the truth with verbs. I returned to my desk and the manual and the pile of narratives that deserved better than competence. I wrote the tidy versions because survival requires we pay the guards, and then I wrote this one, the version with dust on its shoes and stew in its syntax and cats as its only footnotes. This is the confession I promised. The conspiracy is not the point. Conspiracies are furniture. The point is sequence, the order that can heal, and the order that can injure, and the difference between the two being whether widows are allowed to keep their dates, and boys are allowed to sit where their names refused, and women are permitted 3 rooms, and a city learns to feed a cat even when the ledger disapproves. If you are listening on a night made for sleep and not for courage, I ask the only thing I have learned to ask that does not require permission. Do not stop asking. When a calendar tells you a famine has moved and your bread molds wrong, sing yesterday until the air remembers. When a sermon removes the woman who heard first, put her name back and let the scandal fall where it must. When a map smooths a lane you know to be crooked, walk the old way and wave to the cartographer when he blushes. When a saint is redistributed, feed what she left in your kitchen. When a pope's signature looks like winter in June, warm the paper with your breath and see if the ink tells the truth. When a door says it was never there, touch the wall where the draft confesses it is lying. If someone offers you a tidy version, ask for the human one and carry both in your pocket without mistaking either for God. Learn to tell your life out of the permitted order. Teach your children to braid their names with shadows until both sit properly without being made to kneel. Keep one chant in your mouth whose intervals spell the shelf mark of a book that refuses to obey. And if you must keep silence, keep the kind that keeps questions awake. The most dangerous thing for them is that memory returns. It does not return as a mob. It returns as a kitchen, as a widow's calendar, as a boy's eye, as a cat that will not obey stipends, as a seam whose tea is too new for its neighbors, as a ladder that refuses to hold weight, but teaches you the physics of refusal anyway. If you can, light a small candle and refuse to call it a sun. If you cannot, breathe in the dark and do not practice forgetting. I will be here, in the rooms that go down and the stairs that go up, naming the tools and refusing the magic, moving commas and confessing where I place them. When you are asked for minutes, give them kindness. When you are asked for history, give them sequence. When you are asked for obedience, give them a tune that changes key when a poor man enters. If you meet Aurelius before I do, tell him the boy sits properly, the woman keeps all 3 rooms, the widow's mocked the budget, the chemist has learned to write apologies in ash blue, and the orrery still turns, even under glass, because widows sing better than brass. Close your eyes, but do not sleep. Memory is coming back to you in the order they feared.